Chapter 4. The God of Tarzan. Among the books of his dead father in the little cabin by the land-locked harbor, Tarzan of the Apes found many things to puzzle his young head. By much labor and through the medium of infinite patience as well, he had, without assistance, discovered the purpose of the little bugs which ran riot upon the printed pages. He had learned that in the many combinations in which he found them they spoke in a silent language, spoke in a strange tongue, spoke of wonderful things which a little ape boy could not by any chance fully understand, arousing his curiosity, stimulating his imagination, and filling his soul with a mighty longing for further knowledge. A dictionary had proven itself a wonderful storehouse of information when, after several years of tireless endeavor, he had solved the mystery of its purpose and the manner of its use. He had learned to make a species of game out of it, following up the spoor of a new thought through the mazes of the many definitions which each new word required him to consult. It was like following a quarry through the jungle it was hunting, and Tarzan of the Apes was an indefatigable huntsman. There were, of course, certain words which aroused his curiosity to a greater extent than others, words which, for one reason or another, excited his imagination. There was one, for example, the meaning of which was rather difficult to grasp. It was the word God. Tarzan first had been attracted to it by the fact that it was very short, and that it commenced with a larger G-bug than those about it, a male G-bug. It was to Tarzan, the lowercase letters being females. Another fact which attracted him to this word was the number of he-bugs which figured in its definition: supreme deity, creator, or upholder of the universe. This must be a very important word indeed. He would have to look into it, and he did, though it still baffled him after many months of thought and study. However, Tarzan counted no time wasted which he devoted to these strange hunting expeditions into the game preserves of knowledge, for each word and each definition led on and on into strange places, into new worlds where, with increasing frequency, he met old, familiar faces. And always he added to his store of knowledge. But of the meaning of God he was yet in doubt. Once he thought he had grasped it, that God was a mighty chieftain, king of all the Mangani. He was not quite sure, however, since that would mean that God was mightier than Tarzan, a point which Tarzan of the Apes, who acknowledged no equal in the jungle, was loath to concede. But in all the books he had there was no picture of God, though he found much to confirm his belief that God was a great, an all-powerful individual. He saw pictures of places where God was worshipped, but never any sign of God. Finally, he began to wonder if God were not of a different form than he, and at last he determined to set out in search of him. He commenced by questioning Munga, who was very old and had seen many strange things in her long life, but Munga, being an ape, had a faculty for recalling the trivial. That time when Gunta mistook a sting bug for an edible beetle had made more impression upon Munga than all the innumerable manifestations of the greatness of God which she had witnessed, and which, of course, she had not understood. Numgo, overhearing Tarzan's questions, managed to wrest his attention long enough from the diversion of flea hunting to advance the theory that the power which made the lightning and the rain and the thunder came from Goro the moon. He knew this, he said, because the dum-dum always was danced in the light of Goro. This reasoning, though entirely satisfactory to Numgo and Munga, failed fully to convince Tarzan. However, it gave him a basis for further investigation along a new line. He would investigate the moon. That night he clambered to the loftiest pinnacle of the tallest jungle giant. The moon was full, a great, glorious equatorial moon. The ape-man, upright upon a slender, swaying limb, raised his bronzed face to the silver orb. Now that he had clambered to the highest point within his reach, he discovered, to his surprise, that Goro was as far away as when he viewed him from the ground. He thought that Goro was attempting to elude him. "Come, Goro," he cried, "Tarzan of the Apes will not harm you," but still the moon held aloof. "Tell me," he continued, "if you be the great king who sends Ara, the lightning who makes the great noise and the mighty winds, and sends the waters down upon the jungle people when the days are dark and it is cold. Tell me, Goro, are you God?" Of course he did not pronounce God as you or I would pronounce his name, for Tarzan knew naught of the spoken language of his English forebears, but he had a name of his own invention for each of the little bugs which constituted the alphabet. Unlike the apes, he was not satisfied merely to have a mental picture of the things he knew. He must have a word descriptive of each. In reading he grasped a word in its entirety, but when he spoke the words he had learned from the books of his father, he pronounced each according to the names he had given the various little bugs which occurred in it, usually giving the gender prefix for each. Thus it was an imposing word which Tarzan made of God. The masculine prefix of the apes is Biu, the feminine Muji Tarzan had named La. Oh, he pronounced tu and d was mo, so the word God evolved itself into bulamutumo, or in English he g she o she d. Similarly, he had arrived at a strange and wonderful spelling of his own name. Tarzan is derived from the two ape words tar and zan, meaning white skin. It was given him by his foster mother Kala, the great she-ape. When Tarzan first put it into the written language of his own people, he had not yet chanced upon either white or skin in the dictionary, but in a primer he had seen the picture of a little white boy, and so he wrote his name Bumud Mutomuro, or he boy. To follow Tarzan's strange system of spelling would be laborious as well as futile, and so we shall in the future, as we have in the past, adhere to the more familiar forms of our grammar school copybooks. It would tire you to remember that do meant b to o and ro y, and that to say he boy you must prefix the ape masculine gender sound bu before the entire word and the feminine gender sound mu before each of the lowercase letters which go to make up boy. It would tire you, and it would bring me to the 19th hole several strokes under par. And so Tarzan harangued the moon, and when Goro did not reply, Tarzan of the apes waxed wroth. He swelled his giant chest and bared his fighting fangs, and hurled into the teeth of the dead satellite the challenge of the bull ape. "You are not Bulamutumumo," he cried. "You are not king of the jungle folk. You are not so great as Tarzan, mighty fighter, mighty hunter. None there is so great as Tarzan. If there be a Bulamutumumo, Tarzan can kill him. Come down, Goro, great coward, and fight with Tarzan. Tarzan will kill you. I am Tarzan the killer." But the moon made no answer to the boasting of the ape-man, and when a cloud came and obscured her face, Tarzan thought that Goro was indeed afraid, and was hiding from him. So he came down out of the trees and awoke Numgo and told him how great was Tarzan, how he had frightened Goro out of the sky and made him tremble. Tarzan spoke of the moon as he, for all things large or awe-inspiring are male to the ape folk. Numgo was not much impressed, but he was very sleepy, so he told Tarzan to go away and leave his betters alone. "But where shall I find God?" insisted Tarzan. "You are very old. If there is a God, you must have seen him. What does he look like? Where does he look like?" "I am God," replied Numgo. "Now sleep and disturb me no more." Tarzan looked at Numgo steadily for several minutes. His shapely head sank just a trifle between his great shoulders, his square chin shot forward, and his short upper lip drew back, exposing his white teeth. Then, with a low growl, he leaped upon the ape and buried his fangs in the other's hairy shoulder, clutching the great neck in his mighty fingers. Twice he shook the old ape, then he released his tooth hold. "Are you God?" he demanded. "No," wailed Numgo. "I am only a poor old ape. Leave me alone. Go ask the Gomangani where God is. They are hairless like yourself and very wise too, they should know." Tarzan released Numgo and turned away. The suggestion that he consult the blacks appealed to him, and though his relations with the people of Ambonga, the chief, were the antithesis of friendly, he could at least spy upon his hated enemies and discover if they had intercourse with God. So it was that Tarzan set forth, through the trees toward the village of the blacks, all excitement at the prospect of discovering the Supreme Being, the creator of all things. As he traveled, he reviewed mentally his armament, the condition of his hunting knife, the number of his arrows, the newness of the gut which strung his bow. He hefted the war spear which had once been the pride of some black warrior of Mbonga's tribe. If he met God, Tarzan would be prepared. One could never tell whether a grass rope, a war spear, or a poisoned arrow would be most efficacious against an unfamiliar foe. Tarzan of the apes was quite content if God wished to fight. The ape-man had no doubt as to the outcome of the struggle. There were many questions Tarzan wished to put to the creator of the universe, and so he hoped that God would not prove a belligerent God. But his experience of life and the ways of living things had taught him that any creature with the means for offense and defense was quite likely to provoke attack, if in the proper mood. It was dark when Tarzan came to the village of Mbonga. As silently as the silent shadows of the night, he sought his accustomed place among the branches of the great tree which overhung the palisade. Below him, in the village street, he saw men and women. The men were hideously painted, more hideously than usual. Among them moved a weird and grotesque figure, a tall figure that went upon the 2 legs of a man and yet had the head of a buffalo. A tail dangled to his ankles behind him, and in one hand he carried a zebra's tail while the other clutched a bunch of small arrows. Tarzan was electrified. Could it be that chance had given him thus early an opportunity to look upon God? Surely this thing was neither man nor beast, so what could it be then other than the creator of the universe? The ape-man watched the every move of the strange creature, he saw the black men and women fall back at its approach, as though they stood in terror of its mysterious powers. Presently he discovered that the deity was speaking, and that all listened in silence to his words. Tarzan was sure that none other than God could inspire such awe in the hearts of the Gomangani, or stop their mouths so effectually without recourse to arrows or spears. Tarzan had come to look with contempt upon the blacks, principally because of their garrulity. The small apes talked a great deal and ran away from an enemy. The big old bulls of Kerchak talked but little and fought upon the slightest provocation. Numa, the lion, was not given to loquacity, yet of all the jungle folk there were few who fought more often than he. Tarzan witnessed strange things that night, none of which he understood, and perhaps because they were strange, he thought that they must have to do with the god he could not understand. He saw 3 youths receive their first war spears in a weird ceremony which the grotesque witch doctor strove successfully to render uncanny and awesome. Hugely interested, he watched the slashing of the 3 brown arms and the exchange of blood with Mbonga, the chief, in the rites of the ceremony of blood brotherhood. He saw the zebra's tail dipped into a cauldron of water above which the witch doctor had made magical passes the while he danced and leaped about it, and he saw the breasts and foreheads of each of the 3 novitiates sprinkled with the charmed liquid. Could the ape-man have known the purpose of this act, that it was intended to render the recipient invulnerable to the attacks of his enemies and fearless in the face of any danger? He would doubtless have leapt into the village street and appropriated the zebra's tail and a portion of the contents of the cauldron. But he did not know, and so he only wondered, not alone at what he saw, but at the strange sensations which played up and down his naked spine, sensations induced, doubtless, by the same hypnotic influence which held the black spectators in tense awe, upon the verge of a hysteric upheaval. The longer Tarzan watched, the more convinced he became that his eyes were upon God, and with the conviction came determination to have word with the deity. With Tarzan of the Apes, to think was to act. The people of Mbonga were keyed to the highest pitch of hysterical excitement. They needed little to release the accumulated pressure of static nerve force which the terrorizing mummery of the witch doctor had induced. A lion roared, suddenly and loud, close without the palisade. The blacks started nervously, dropping into utter silence as they listened for a repetition of that all too familiar and always terrorizing voice. Even the witch doctor paused in the midst of an intricate step, remaining momentarily rigid and statuesque as he plumbed his cunning mind for a suggestion as how best he might take advantage of the condition of his audience and the timely interruption. Already the evening had been vastly profitable to him. There would be 3 goats for the initiation of the 3 youths into full-fledged warriorship, and besides these he had received several gifts of grain and beads, together with a piece of copper wire from admiring and terrified members of his audience. Numa's roar still reverberated along taut nerves when a woman's laugh, shrill and piercing, shattered the silence of the village. It was this moment that Tarzan chose to drop lightly from his tree into the village street. Fearless among his blood enemies he stood, taller by a full head than many of Mbonga's warriors, straight as their straightest arrow, muscled like Numa, the lion. For a moment Tarzan stood looking straight at the witch doctor. Every eye was upon him, yet no one had moved. A paralysis of terror held them, to be broken a moment later as the ape-man, with a toss of head, stepped straight toward the hideous figure beneath the buffalo head. Then the nerves of the blacks could stand no more. For months the terror of the strange, white jungle god had been upon them. Their arrows had been stolen from the very center of the village, their warriors had been silently slain upon the jungle trails, and their dead bodies dropped mysteriously, and by night into the village street as from the heavens above. 1 or 2 there were who had glimpsed the strange figure of the new demon, and it was from their oft-repeated descriptions that the entire village now recognized Tarzan as the author of many of their ills. Upon another occasion, and by daylight, the warriors would doubtless have leaped to attack him, but at night, and this night of all others, when they were wrought to such a pitch of nervous dread by the uncanny artistry of their witch doctor, they were helpless with terror. As one man they turned and fled, scattering for their huts, as Tarzan advanced. For a moment one and one only held his ground. It was the witch doctor. More than half self-hypnotized into a belief in his own charlatanry, he faced this new demon who threatened to undermine his ancient and lucrative profession. "Are you God?" asked Tarzan. The witch doctor, having no idea of the meaning of the other's words, danced a few strange steps, leaped high in the air, turning completely around and alighting in a stooping posture with feet far outspread and head thrust out toward the ape-man. Thus he remained for an instant before he uttered a loud boo which was evidently intended to frighten Tarzan away but in reality had no such effect. Tarzan did not pause. He had set out to approach and examine God, and nothing upon earth might now stay his feet. Seeing that his antics had no potency with the visitor, the witch doctor tried some new medicine. Spitting upon the zebra's tail, which he still clutched in one hand, he made circles above it with the arrows in the other hand, meanwhile backing cautiously away from Tarzan and speaking confidentially to the bushy end of the tail. This medicine must be short medicine, however, for the creature, god or demon, was steadily closing up the distance which had separated them. The circles therefore were few and rapid, and when they were completed, the witch doctor struck an attitude which was intended to be awe-inspiring, and waving the zebra's tail before him, drew an imaginary line between himself and Tarzan. "Beyond this line you cannot pass, for my medicine is strong medicine," he cried. "Stop, or you will fall dead as your foot touches this spot. My mother was a voodoo, my father was a snake, I live upon lions' hearts and the entrails of the panther, I eat young babies for breakfast, and the demons of the jungle are my slaves. I am the most powerful witch doctor in the world. I fear nothing, for I cannot die." But he got no further. Instead, he turned and fled as Tarzan of the Apes crossed the magical deadline and still lived. As the witch doctor ran, Tarzan almost lost his temper. This was no way for God to act, at least not in accordance with the conception Tarzan had come to have of God. "Come back," he cried. "Come back, God, I will not harm you." But the witch doctor was in full retreat by this time, stepping high as he leaped over cooking pots and the smoldering embers of small fires that had burned before the huts of villagers. Straight for his own hut ran the witch doctor, terror spurred to unwonted speed, but futile was his effort. The ape-man bore down upon him with the speed of Bara the deer. Just at the entrance to his hut the witch doctor was overhauled. A heavy hand fell upon his shoulder to drag him back. It seized upon a portion of the buffalo hide, dragging the disguise from him. It was a naked black man that Tarzan saw dodge into the darkness of the hut's interior. So this was what he had thought was God. Tarzan's lip curled in an angry snarl as he leaped into the hut after the terror-stricken witch doctor. In the blackness within he found the man huddled at the far side and dragged him forth into the comparative lightness of the moonlit night. The witch doctor bit and scratched in an attempt to escape, but a few cuffs across the head brought him to a better realization of the futility of resistance. Beneath the moon, Tarzan held the cringing figure upon its shaking feet. "So you are God," he cried. "If you be God, then Tarzan is greater than God," and so the ape-man thought. "I am Tarzan," he shouted into the ear of the black. "In all the jungle, or above it, or upon the running waters, or the sleeping waters, or upon the big water, or the little water, there is none so great as Tarzan. Tarzan is greater than the Mangani, he is greater than the Gomangani. With his own hands he has slain Numa, the lion, and Cheetah. The panther, there is none so great as Tarzan. Tarzan is greater than God. See," and with a sudden wrench he twisted the black's neck until the fellow shrieked in pain and then slumped to the earth in a swoon. Placing his foot upon the neck of the fallen witch doctor, the ape-man raised his face to the moon and uttered the long, shrill scream of the victorious bull-ape. Then he stooped and snatched the zebra's tail from the nerveless fingers of the unconscious man, and without a backward glance retraced his footsteps across the village. From several hut doorways frightened eyes watched him. Mbonga, the chief, was one of those who had seen what passed before the hut of the witch doctor. Mbonga was greatly concerned. Wise old patriarch that he was, he never had more than half believed in witch doctors, at least not since greater wisdom had come with age, but as a chief he was well convinced of the power of the witch doctor as an arm of government. And often it was that Mbonga used the superstitious fears of his people to his own ends through the medium of the medicine man. Mbonga and the witch doctor had worked together and divided the spoils, and now the face of the witch doctor would be lost forever if any saw what Mbonga had seen, nor would this generation again have as much faith in any future witch doctor. Mbonga must do something to counteract the evil influence of the forest demon's victory over the witch doctor. He raised his heavy spear and crept silently from his hut in the wake of the retreating ape-man. Down the village street walked Tarzan, as unconcerned and as deliberate as though only the friendly apes of Kerchak surrounded him instead of a village full of armed enemies. Seeming only was the indifference of Tarzan, for alert and watchful was every well-trained sense. Mbonga, wily stalker of keen-eared jungle creatures, moved now in utter silence. Not even Bara, the deer with his great ears, could have guessed from any sound that Mbonga was near, but the black was not stalking Bara, he was stalking man, and so he sought only to avoid noise. Closer and closer to the slowly moving ape-man he came. Now he raised his war spear, throwing his spear hand far back above his right shoulder. Once and for all would Mbonga, the chief, rid himself and his people of the menace of this terrifying enemy. He would make no poor cast, he would take pains, and he would hurl his weapon with such great force as would finish the demon forever. But Mbonga, sure as he thought himself, erred in his calculations. He might believe that he was stalking a man he did not know, however, that it was a man with the delicate sense perception of the lower orders. Tarzan, when he had turned his back upon his enemies, had noted what Mbonga never would have thought of considering in the hunting of man, the wind. It was blowing in the same direction that Tarzan was proceeding, carrying to his delicate nostrils the odors which arose behind him. Thus it was that Tarzan knew that he was being followed, for even among the many stenches of an African village, the ape-man's uncanny faculty was equal to the task of differentiating one stench from another and locating with remarkable precision the source from whence it came. He knew that a man was following him and coming closer, and his judgment warned him of the purpose of the stalker. When Mbonga, therefore, came within spear range of the ape-man, the latter suddenly wheeled upon him, so suddenly that the poised spear was shot a fraction of a second before Mbonga had intended. It went a trifle high and Tarzan stooped to let it pass over his head, then he sprang toward the chief. But Mbonga did not wait to receive him. Instead, he turned and fled for the dark doorway of the nearest hut, calling as he went for his warriors to fall upon the stranger and slay him. Well indeed might Mbonga scream for help, for Tarzan, young and fleet-footed, covered the distance between them in great leaps at the speed of a charging lion. He was growling too, not at all unlike Numa himself. Mbonga heard and his blood ran cold. He could feel the wool stiffen upon his pate and a prickly chill run up his spine, as though death had come and run his cold finger along Mbonga's back. Others heard too and saw from the darkness of their huts bold warriors, hideously painted, grasping heavy war spears in nerveless fingers. Against Numa the lion they would have charged fearlessly. Against many times their own number of black warriors would they have raced to the protection of their chief, but this weird jungle demon filled them with terror. There was nothing human in the bestial growls that rumbled up from his deep chest. There was nothing human in the bared fangs or the cat-like leaps. Mbonga's warriors were terrified, too terrified to leave the seeming security of their huts while they watched the beast-man spring full upon the back of their old chieftain. Mbonga went down with a scream of terror. He was too frightened even to attempt to defend himself. He just lay beneath his antagonist in a paralysis of fear, screaming at the top of his lungs. Tarzan half rose and kneeled above the black. He turned Mbonga over and looked him in the face, exposing the man's throat. Then he drew his long, keen knife, the knife that John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, had brought from England many years before. He raised it close above Mbonga's neck. The old black whimpered with terror. He pleaded for his life in a tongue which Tarzan could not understand. For the first time the ape-man had a close view of the chief. He saw an old man, a very old man with scrawny neck and wrinkled face, a dried parchment-like face which resembled some of the little monkeys Tarzan knew so well. He saw the terror in the man's eyes. Never before had Tarzan seen such terror in the eyes of any animal, or such a piteous appeal for mercy upon the face of any creature. Something stayed the ape-man's hand for an instant. He wondered why it was that he hesitated to make the kill. Never before had he thus delayed. The old man seemed to wither and shrink to a bag of puny bones beneath his eyes. So weak and helpless and terror-stricken he appeared that the ape-man was filled with a great contempt, but another sensation also claimed him, something new to Tarzan of the apes in relation to an enemy. It was pity for a poor, frightened old man. Tarzan rose and turned away, leaving Mbonga, the chief, unharmed. With head held high the ape-man walked through the village, swung himself into the branches of the tree which overhung the palisade and disappeared from the sight of the villagers. All the way back to the stamping ground of the apes, Tarzan sought for an explanation of the strange power which had stayed his hand and prevented him from slaying Mbonga. It was as though someone greater than he had commanded him to spare the life of the old man. Tarzan could not understand, for he could conceive of nothing or no one with the authority to dictate to him what he should do or what he should refrain from doing. It was late when Tarzan sought a swaying couch among the trees beneath which slept the apes of Kerchak, and he was still absorbed in the solution of his strange problem when he fell asleep. The sun was well up in the heavens when he awoke. The apes were astir in search of food. Tarzan watched them lazily from above as they scratched in the rotting loam for bugs and beetles and grubworms, or sought among the branches of the trees for eggs and young birds, or luscious caterpillars. An orchid dangling close beside his head opened slowly, unfolding its delicate petals to the warmth and light of the sun which, but recently, had penetrated to its shady retreat. 1,000 times had Tarzan of the apes witnessed the beauteous miracle, but now it aroused a keener interest, for the ape-man was just commencing to ask himself questions about all the myriad wonders which heretofore he had but taken for granted. What made the flower open? What made it grow from a tiny bud to a full-blown bloom? Why was it at all? Why was he? Where did Numa the lion come from? Who planted the first tree? How did Goro get way up into the darkness of the night sky to cast his welcome light upon the fearsome nocturnal jungle? And the sun? Did the sun merely happen there? Why were all the peoples of the jungle not trees? Why were the trees not something else? Why was Tarzan different from Tog, and Tog different from Bara the deer, and Bara different from Cheetah the panther, and why was not Cheetah like Buto the rhinoceros? Where and how, anyway, did they all come from? The trees, the flowers, the insects, the countless creatures of the jungle? Quite unexpectedly, an idea popped into Tarzan's head. In following out the many ramifications of the dictionary definition of God, he had come upon the word create, to cause to come into existence, to form out of nothing. Tarzan almost had arrived at something tangible when a distant wail startled him from his preoccupation into sensibility of the present and the real. The wail came from the jungle at some little distance from Tarzan's swaying couch. It was the wail of a tiny balu. Tarzan recognized it at once as the voice of Gazan, Tika's baby. They had called it Gazan because its soft baby hair had been unusually red, and Gazan, in the language of the great apes, means red skin. The wail was immediately followed by a real scream of terror from the small lungs. Tarzan was electrified into instant action. Like an arrow from a bow, he shot through the trees in the direction of the sound. Ahead of him, he heard the savage snarling of an adult she-ape. It was Tika to the rescue. The danger must be very real. Tarzan could tell that by the note of rage mingled with fear in the voice of the she. Running along bending limbs, swinging from one tree to another, the ape-man raced through the middle terraces toward the sounds which now had risen in volume to deafening proportions. From all directions the apes of Kerchak were hurrying in response to the appeal in the tones of the balu and its mother, and as they came, their roars reverberated through the forest. But Tarzan, swifter than his heavy fellows, distanced them all. It was he who was first upon the scene. What he saw sent a cold chill through his giant frame, for the enemy was the most hated and loathed of all the jungle creatures. Twined in a great tree was Hista, the snake, huge, ponderous, slimy, and in the folds of its deadly embrace was Tika's little balu Gazan. Nothing in the jungle inspired within the breast of Tarzan so near a semblance to fear as did the hideous Hista. The apes, too, loathed the terrifying reptile and feared him even more than they did Cheetah, the panther, or Numa, the lion. Of all their enemies, there was none they gave a wider berth than they gave Hista, the snake. Tarzan knew that Tika was peculiarly fearful of this silent, repulsive foe, and as the scene broke upon his vision, it was the action of Tika which filled him with the greatest wonder, for at the moment that he saw her, the she-ape leapt upon the glistening body of the snake. And as the mighty folds encircled her as well as her offspring, she made no effort to escape, but instead grasped the writhing body in a futile effort to tear it from her screaming balu. Tarzan knew all too well how deep-rooted was Tika's terror of Hista. He scarce could believe the testimony of his own eyes then, when they told him that she had voluntarily rushed into that deadly embrace. Nor was Tika's innate dread of the monster much greater than Tarzan's own. Never willingly had he touched a snake. Why, he could not say, for he would admit fear of nothing, nor was it fear, but rather an inherent repulsion bequeathed to him by many generations of civilized ancestors, and back of them, perhaps by countless myriads of such as Tika, in the breasts of each of which had lurked the same nameless terror of the slimy reptile. Yet Tarzan did not hesitate more than had Tika, but leaped upon Hista with all the speed and impetuosity that he would have shown had he been springing upon Bara, the deer, to make a kill for food. Thus beset, the snake writhed and twisted horribly, but not for an instant did it loose its hold upon any of its intended victims, for it had included the ape-man in its cold embrace the minute that he had fallen upon it. Still clinging to the tree, the mighty reptile held the three as though they had been without weight, the while it sought to crush the life from them. Tarzan had drawn his knife, and this he now plunged rapidly into the body of the enemy, but the encircling folds promised to sap his life before he had inflicted a death wound upon the snake. Yet on he fought, nor once did he seek to escape the horrid death that confronted him. His sole aim was to slay Hista and thus free Tika and her balu. The great, wide gaping jaws of the snake turned and hovered above him. The elastic maw, which could accommodate a rabbit or a horned buck with equal facility, yawned for him, but Hista, in turning his attention upon the ape-man, brought his head within reach of Tarzan's blade. Instantly a brown hand leaped forth and seized the mottled neck, and another drove the heavy hunting knife to the hilt into the little brain. Convulsively Hista shuddered and relaxed, tensed and relaxed again, whipping and striking with his great body but no longer sentient or sensible. Hista was dead, but in his death throes he might easily dispatch a dozen apes or men. Quickly Tarzan seized Tika and dragged her from the loosened embrace, dropping her to the ground beneath. Then he extricated the balu and tossed it to its mother. Still Hista whipped about, clinging to the ape-man, but after a dozen efforts Tarzan succeeded in wriggling free and leaping to the ground out of range of the mighty battering of the dying snake. A circle of apes surrounded the scene of the battle, but the moment that Tarzan broke safely from the enemy they turned silently away to resume their interrupted feeding, and Tika turned with them. Apparently forgetful of all but her balu and the fact that when the interruption had occurred she just had discovered an ingeniously hidden nest containing 3 perfectly good eggs. Tarzan, equally indifferent to a battle that was over, merely cast a parting glance at the still writhing body of Hista and wandered off toward the little pool which served to water the tribe at this point. Strangely, he did not give the victory cry over the vanquished Hista. Why, he could not have told you, other than that to him Hista was not an animal. He differed in some peculiar way from the other denizens of the jungle. Tarzan only knew that he hated him. At the pool Tarzan drank his fill and lay stretched upon the soft grass beneath the shade of a tree. His mind reverted to the battle with Hista, the snake. It seemed strange to him that Tika should have placed herself within the folds of the horrid monster. Why had she done it? Why indeed had he? Tika did not belong to him, nor did Tika's balu. They were both togs. Why then had he done this thing? Hista was not food for him when he was dead. There seemed to Tarzan, now that he gave the matter thought, no reason in the world why he should have done the thing he did, and presently it occurred to him that he had acted almost involuntarily, just as he had acted when he had released the old Gomangani the previous evening. What made him do such things? Somebody more powerful than he must force him to act at times. All-powerful, thought Tarzan. The little bugs say that God is all-powerful. It must be that God made me do these things, for I never did them by myself. It was God who made Tika rush upon Hista. Tika would never go near Hista of her own volition. It was God who held my knife from the throat of the old Gomangani. God accomplishes strange things, for he is all-powerful. I cannot see him. But I know that it must be God who does these things. No Mangani, no Gomangani, no Tarmangani could do them. And the flowers who made them grow. Ah, now it was all explained. The flowers, the trees, the moon, the sun, himself, every living creature in the jungle, they were all made by God out of nothing. And what was God? What did God look like? Of that he had no conception, but he was sure that everything that was good came from God. His good act in refraining from slaying the poor, defenseless old Gomangani, Tika's love that had hurled her into the embrace of death, his own loyalty to Tika, which had jeopardized his life that she might live. The flowers and the trees were good and beautiful. God had made them. He made the other creatures too, that each might have food upon which to live. He had made Cheetah, the panther, with his beautiful coat, and Numa, the lion, with his noble head and his shaggy mane. He had made Bara, the deer, lovely and graceful. Yes, Tarzan had found God, and he spent the whole day in attributing to him all of the good and beautiful things of nature, but there was one thing which troubled him. He could not quite reconcile it to his conception of his newfound God, who made Hista the snake. Chapter 5. Tarzan and the Black Boy. Tarzan of the apes sat at the foot of a great tree braiding a new grass rope. Beside him lay the frayed remnants of the old one, torn and severed by the fangs and talons of Cheetah, the panther. Only half the original rope was there, the balance having been carried off by the angry cat as he bounded away through the jungle with the noose still about his savage neck and the loose end dragging among the underbrush. Tarzan smiled as he recalled Cheetah's great rage, his frantic efforts to free himself from the entangling strands, his uncanny screams that were part hate, part anger, part terror. He smiled in retrospection at the discomfiture of his enemy and in anticipation of another day as he added an extra strand to his new rope. This would be the strongest, the heaviest rope that Tarzan of the Apes ever had fashioned. Visions of Numa the lion straining futilely in its embrace thrilled the ape man. He was quite content, for his hands and his brain were busy. Content, too, were his fellows of the tribe of Kerchak, searching for food in the clearing and the surrounding trees about him. No perplexing thoughts of the future burdened their minds, and only occasionally dimly arose recollections of the near past. They were stimulated to a species of brutal content by the delectable business of filling their bellies. Afterward they would sleep. It was their life, and they enjoyed it as we enjoy ours, you and I, as Tarzan enjoyed his. Possibly they enjoyed theirs more than we enjoy ours, for who shall say that the beasts of the jungle do not better fulfill the purposes for which they are created than does man with his many excursions into strange fields and his contraventions of the laws of nature? And what gives greater content and greater happiness than the fulfilling of a destiny? As Tarzan worked, Gazan, Tika's little balu, played about him while Tika sought food upon the opposite side of the clearing. No more did Tika, the mother, or Tog, the sullen sire, harbor suspicions of Tarzan's intentions toward their firstborn. Had he not courted death to save their Gazan from the fangs and talons of Sheeta? Did he not fondle and cuddle the little one with even as great a show of affection as Tika herself displayed? Their fears were allayed, and Tarzan now found himself often in the role of nursemaid to a tiny anthropoid, an avocation which he found by no means irksome, since Gazan was a never-failing fount of surprises and entertainment. Just now the apeling was developing those arboreal tendencies which were to stand him in such good stead during the years of his youth, when rapid flight into the upper terraces was of far more importance and value than his undeveloped muscles and untried fighting fangs. Backing off 15 or 20 feet from the bole of the tree beneath the branches of which Tarzan worked upon his rope, Gazan scampered quickly forward, scrambling nimbly upward to the lower limbs. Here he would squat for a moment or two, quite proud of his achievement, then clamber to the ground again and repeat. Sometimes, quite often in fact, for he was an ape, his attention was distracted by other things, a beetle, a caterpillar, a tiny field mouse, and off he would go in pursuit. The caterpillars he always caught, and sometimes the beetles, but the field mice never. Now he discovered the tail of the rope upon which Tarzan was working. Grasping it in one small hand, he bounced away, for all the world like an animated rubber ball, snatching it from the ape-man's hand and running off across the clearing. Tarzan leaped to his feet and was in pursuit in an instant, no trace of anger on his face or in his voice as he called to the roguish little balu to drop his rope. Straight toward his mother raced Gazan, and after him came Tarzan. Tika looked up from her feeding, and in the first instant that she realized that Gazan was fleeing and that another was in pursuit, she bared her fangs and bristled, but when she saw that the pursuer was Tarzan, she turned back to the business that had been occupying her attention. At her very feet the ape-man overhauled the balu, and though the youngster squealed and fought when Tarzan seized him, Tika only glanced casually in their direction. No longer did she fear harm to her firstborn at the hands of the ape-man. Had he not saved Gazan on 2 occasions? Rescuing his rope, Tarzan returned to his tree and resumed his labor, but thereafter it was necessary to watch carefully the playful balu, who was now possessed to steal it whenever he thought his great, smooth-skinned cousin was momentarily off his guard. But even under this handicap, Tarzan finally completed the rope, a long, pliant weapon, stronger than any he ever had made before. The discarded piece of his former one he gave to Gazan for a plaything, for Tarzan had it in his mind to instruct Tika's balu after ideas of his own when the youngster should be old and strong enough to profit by his precepts. At present, the little ape's innate aptitude for mimicry would be sufficient to familiarize him with Tarzan's ways and weapons, and so the ape-man swung off into the jungle, his new rope coiled over one shoulder, while little Gazan hopped about the clearing, dragging the old one after him in childish glee. As Tarzan traveled, dividing his quest for food with one for a sufficiently noble quarry whereupon to test his new weapon, his mind often was upon Gazan. The ape-man had realized a deep affection for Tika's balu almost from the first, partly because the child belonged to Tika, his first love, and partly for the little ape's own sake. And Tarzan's human longing for some sentient creature upon which to expend those natural affections of the soul which are inherent to all normal members of the genus Homo. Tarzan envied Tika. It was true that Gazan evidenced a considerable reciprocation of Tarzan's fondness for him, even preferring him to his own surly sire, but to Tika the little one turned when in pain or terror, when tired or hungry. Then it was that Tarzan felt quite alone in the world and longed desperately for one who should turn first to him for succor and protection. Taug had Tika Tika had Gazan, and nearly every other bull and cow of the tribe of Kerchak had one or more to love, and by whom to be loved. Of course, Tarzan could scarcely formulate the thought in precisely this way. He only knew that he craved something which was denied him, something which seemed to be represented by those relations which existed between Tika and her balu, and so he envied Tika and longed for a balu of his own. He saw Sheeta and his mate with their little family of 3 and deeper inland toward the rocky hills, where one might lie up during the heat of the day in the dense shade of a tangled thicket close under the cool face of an overhanging rock. Tarzan had found the lair of Numa, the lion, and of Seba, the lioness. Here he had watched them with their little ballast playful creatures, spotted leopard-like. And he had seen the young fawn with Bara, the deer, and with Buto, the rhinoceros, its ungainly little one. Each of the creatures of the jungle had its own except Tarzan. It made the ape-man sad to think upon this thing, sad and lonely, but presently the scent of game cleared his young mind of all other considerations. As cat-like he crawled far out upon a bending limb above the game trail which led down to the ancient watering place of the wild things of this wild world. How many thousands of times had this great, old limb bent to the savage form of some bloodthirsty hunter in the long years that it had spread its leafy branches above the deep-worn jungle path. Tarzan, the ape-man, Sheeta, the panther, and Hista, the snake, it knew well. They had worn smooth the bark upon its upper surface. Today it was Horta, the boar, which came down toward the watcher in the old tree. Horta, the boar, whose formidable tusks and diabolical temper preserved him from all but the most ferocious or most famished of the largest carnivora. But to Tarzan meat was meat, naught that was edible or tasty might pass a hungry Tarzan unchallenged and unattacked. In hunger as in battle, the ape-man out-savaged the dreariest denizens of the jungle. He knew neither fear nor mercy, except upon rare occasions when some strange, inexplicable force stayed his hand, a force inexplicable to him perhaps, because of his ignorance of his own origin and of all the forces of humanitarianism and civilization that were his rightful heritage because of that origin. So today, instead of staying his hand until a less formidable feast found its way toward him, Tarzan dropped his new noose about the neck of Horta, the boar. It was an excellent test for the untried strands. The angered boar bolted this way and that, but each time the new rope held him where Tarzan had made it fast about the stem of the tree, above the branch from which he had cast it. As Horta grunted and charged, slashing the sturdy jungle patriarch with his mighty tusks until the bark flew in every direction, Tarzan dropped to the ground behind him. In the ape-man's hand was the long, keen blade that had been his constant companion since that distant day upon which chance had directed its point into the body of Bolgani, the gorilla, and saved the torn and bleeding man-child from what else had been certain death. Tarzan walked in toward Horta, who swung now to face his enemy. Mighty and muscled as was the young giant, it yet would have appeared but the maddest folly for him to face so formidable a creature as Horta, the boar, armed only with a slender hunting knife. So it would have seemed to one who knew Horta even slightly, and Tarzan not at all. For a moment Horta stood motionless facing the ape-man. His wicked, deep-set eyes flashed angrily. He shook his lowered head. "Mud-eater," jeered the ape-man, "wallower in filth. Even your meat stinks, but it is juicy and makes Tarzan strong. Today I shall eat your heart, O Lord of the great tusks, that it shall keep savage that which pounds against my own ribs." Horta, understanding nothing of what Tarzan said, was none the less enraged because of that. He saw only a naked man-thing, hairless and futile, pitting his puny fangs and soft muscles against his own indomitable savagery, and he charged. Tarzan of the apes waited until the upcut of a wicked tusk would have laid open his thigh. Then he moved just the least bit to one side, but so quickly that lightning was a sluggard by comparison, and as he moved, he stooped low and with all the great power of his right arm, drove the long blade of his father's hunting knife straight into the heart of Horta, the boar. A quick leap carried him from the zone of the creature's death throes, and a moment later the hot and dripping heart of Horta was in his grasp. His hunger satisfied, Tarzan did not seek a lying-up place for sleep, as was sometimes his way, but continued on through the jungle more in search of adventure than of food, for today he was restless. And so it came that he turned his footsteps toward the village of Mbonga, the black chief, whose people Tarzan had baited remorselessly since that day upon which Kulonga, the chief's son, had slain Kala. A river winds close beside the village of the black men. Tarzan reached its side a little below the clearing where squat the thatched huts of the Negroes. The river life was ever fascinating to the ape-man. He found pleasure in watching the ungainly antics of Duro, the hippopotamus, and keen sport in tormenting the sluggish crocodile, Gimla, as he basked in the sun. Then, too, there were the Shis and the Balas of the black men of the Gomangani to frighten as they squatted by the river, the Shias with their meager washing, the Balas with their primitive toys. This day he came upon a woman and her child farther downstream than usual. The former was searching for a species of shellfish which was to be found in the mud close to the river bank. She was a young black woman of about 30. Her teeth were filed to sharp points, for her people ate the flesh of man. Her under lip was slit that it might support a rude pendant of copper which she had worn for so many years that the lip had been dragged downward to prodigious lengths, exposing the teeth and gums of her lower jaw. Her nose, too, was slit, and through the slit was a wooden skewer. Metal ornaments dangled from her ears, and upon her forehead and cheeks upon her chin, and the bridge of her nose were tattooings in colors that were mellowed now by age. She was naked except for a girdle of grasses about her waist. Altogether she was very beautiful in her own estimation and even in the estimation of the men of Mbonga's tribe, though she was of another people a trophy of war seized in her maidenhood by one of Mbonga's fighting men. Her child was a boy of 10, lithe, straight, and for a black handsome. Tarzan looked upon the two from the concealing foliage of a nearby bush. He was about to leap forth before them with a terrifying scream, that he might enjoy the spectacle of their terror and their incontinent flight, but of a sudden a new whim seized him. Here was a balu fashioned as he himself was fashioned. Of course this one's skin was black, but what of it? Tarzan had never seen a white man. In so far as he knew, he was the sole representative of that strange form of life upon the earth. The black boy should make an excellent balu for Tarzan, since he had none of his own. He would tend him carefully, feed him well, protect him as only Tarzan of the Apes could protect his own, and teach him out of his half-human, half-bestial lore the secrets of the jungle, from its rotting surface vegetation to the high-tossed pinnacles of the forest's upper terraces. Tarzan uncoiled his rope and shook out the noose. The two before him, all ignorant of the near presence of that terrifying form, continued preoccupied in the search for shellfish, poking about in the mud with short sticks. Tarzan stepped from the jungle behind them. His noose lay open upon the ground beside him. There was a quick movement of the right arm, and the noose rose gracefully into the air, hovered an instant above the head of the unsuspecting youth, then settled. As it encompassed his body below the shoulders, Tarzan gave a quick jerk that tightened it about the boy's arms, pinioning them to his sides. A scream of terror broke from the lad's lips, and as his mother turned, affrighted at his cry, she saw him being dragged quickly toward a great white giant who stood just beneath the shade of a nearby tree, scarcely a dozen long paces from her. With a savage cry of terror and rage, the woman leaped fearlessly toward the ape-man. In her mien Tarzan saw determination and courage which would shrink not even from death itself. She was very hideous and frightful even when her face was in repose, but convulsed by passion her expression became terrifyingly fiendish. Even the ape-man drew back, but more in revulsion than fear he knew not. Biting and kicking was the black she's balu as Tarzan tucked him beneath his arm and vanished into the branches hanging low above him, just as the infuriated mother dashed forward to seize and do battle with him. And as he melted away into the depth of the jungle with his still struggling prize, he meditated upon the possibilities which might lie in the prowess of the Gomangani were the His, as formidable as the Shes. Once at a safe distance from the despoiled mother and out of earshot of her screams and menaces, Tarzan paused to inspect his prize, now so thoroughly terrorized that he had ceased his struggles and his outcries. The frightened child rolled his eyes fearfully toward his captor, until the whites showed gleaming all about the irises. "I am Tarzan," said the ape-man, in the vernacular of the anthropoids. "I will not harm you. You are to be Tarzan's balu. Tarzan will protect you. He will feed you. The best in the jungle shall be for Tarzan's balu, for Tarzan's balu, for Tarzan is a mighty hunter. None need you fear, not even Numa the lion, for Tarzan is a mighty fighter, none so great as Tarzan. Son of Kala, do not fear." But the child only whimpered and trembled, for he did not understand the tongue of the great apes, and the voice of Tarzan sounded to him like the barking and growling of a beast. Then, too, he had heard stories of this bad white forest god. It was he who had slain Kolonga and others of the warriors of Mbonga, the chief. It was he who entered the village stealthily, by magic, in the darkness of the night, to steal arrows and poison, and frighten the women and the children and even the great warriors. Doubtless this wicked god fed upon little boys, Had his mother not said as much when he was naughty and she threatened to give him to the white god of the jungle if he were not good? Little black Tibo shook as with ague. "Are you cold, Gobu Balu?" asked Tarzan, using the simian equivalent of Blackie Baby in lieu of a better name. "The sun is hot, why do you shiver?" Tibo could not understand, but he cried for his mama and begged the great white god to let him go, promising always to be a good boy thereafter if his plea were granted. Tarzan shook his head. Not a word could he understand. This would never do. He must teach Gobu Balu a language which sounded like talk. It was quite certain to Tarzan that Gobu Balu's speech was not talk at all. It sounded quite as senseless as the chattering of the silly birds. It would be best, thought the ape-man, quickly to get him among the tribe of Kerchak, where he would hear the Mangani talking among themselves. Thus he would soon learn an intelligible form of speech. Tarzan rose to his feet upon the swaying branch where he had halted far above the ground and motioned to the child to follow him, but Tibo only clung tightly to the bole of the tree and wept. Being a boy and a native African, he had, of course, climbed into trees many times before this, but the idea of racing off through the forest, leaping from one branch to another, as his captor, to his horror, had done when he had carried Tibo away from his mother, filled his childish heart with terror. Tarzan sighed. His newly acquired balu had much indeed to learn. It was pitiful that a balu of his size and strength should be so backward. He tried to coax Tibo to follow him, but the child dared not, so Tarzan picked him up and carried him upon his back. Tibo no longer scratched or bit. Escape seemed impossible. Even now, where he sat upon the ground, the chance was remote. He knew that he could find his way back to the village of Mbonga, the chief. Even if he could, there were the lions and the leopards and the hyenas, any one of which, as Tibo was well aware, was particularly fond of the meat of little black boys. So far, the terrible white god of the jungle had offered him no harm. He could not expect even this much consideration from the frightful green-eyed man-eaters. It would be the lesser of two evils, then, to let the white god carry him away without scratching and biting, as he had done at first. As Tarzan swung rapidly through the trees, little Tibo closed his eyes in terror, rather than look longer down into the frightful abysses beneath. Never before in all his life had Tibo been so frightened, yet as the white giant sped on with him through the forest, there stole over the child an inexplicable sensation of security as he saw how true were the leaps of the ape-man. How unerring his grasp upon the swaying limbs which gave him hand-hold, and then, too, there was safety in the middle terraces of the forest, far above the reach of the dreaded lions. And so Tarzan came to the clearing where the tribe fed, dropping among them with his new balu clinging tightly to his shoulders. He was fairly in the midst of them before Tibo spied a single one of the great hairy forms, or before the apes realized that Tarzan was not alone. When they saw the little Gomangani perched upon his back, some of them came forward in curiosity with upcurled lips and snarling mien. An hour before, little Tibo would have said that he knew the uttermost depths of fear, but now, as he saw these fearsome beasts surrounding him, he realized that all that had gone before was as nothing by comparison. Why did the great white giant stand there so unconcernedly? Why did he not flee before these horrid, hairy tree men fell upon them both and tore them to pieces? And then there came to Tibo a numbing recollection. It was none other than the story he had heard passed from mouth to mouth fearfully by the people of Mbonga, the chief, that this great white demon of the jungle was naught other than a hairless ape, for had not he been seen in company with these? Tibo could only stare in wide-eyed horror at the approaching apes. He saw their beetling brows, their great fangs, their wicked eyes. He noted their mighty muscles rolling beneath their shaggy hides. Their every attitude and expression was a menace. Tarzan saw this too. He drew Tibo around in front of him. "This is Tarzan's Gobu Balu," he said. "Do not harm him, or Tarzan will kill you," and he bared his own fangs in the teeth of the nearest ape. "It is a Gomangani," replied the ape. "Let me kill it. It is a Gomangani. The Gomangani are our enemies. Let me kill it." "Go away," snarled Tarzan. "I tell you, Gunto, it is Tarzan's Balu. Go away or Tarzan will kill you," and the ape-man took a step toward the advancing ape. The latter sidled off, quite stiff and haughty, after the manner of a dog which meets another and is too proud to fight and too fearful to turn his back and run. Next came Tika, prompted by curiosity. At her side skipped little Gazan. They were filled with wonder like the others, but Tika did not bare her fangs. Tarzan saw this and motioned that she approach. "Tarzan has a balu now," he said. "He and Tika's balu can play together." "It is a Gomangani," replied Tika. "It will kill my balu. Take it away, Tarzan." Tarzan laughed. "It could not harm Pamba, the rat," he said. "It is but a little balu and very frightened. Let Gazan play with it." Tika still was fearful, for with all their mighty ferocity the great anthropoids are timid, but at last, assured by her great confidence in Tarzan, she pushed Gazan forward toward the little black boy. The small ape, guided by instinct, drew back toward its mother, baring its small fangs and screaming in mingled fear and rage. Tibo, too, showed no signs of desiring a closer acquaintance with Gazan, so Tarzan gave up his efforts for the time. During the week which followed, Tarzan found his time much occupied. His balu was a greater responsibility than he had counted upon. Not for a moment did he dare leave it, since of all the tribe, Tika alone could have been depended upon to refrain from slaying the hapless black had it not been for Tarzan's constant watchfulness. When the ape-man hunted, he must carry Go-Bu-Balu about with him. It was irksome, and then the little black seemed so stupid and fearful to Tarzan. It was quite helpless against even the lesser of the jungle creatures. Tarzan wondered how it had survived at all. He tried to teach it, and found a ray of hope in the fact that Go-Bu-Balu had mastered a few words of the language of the anthropoids, and that he could now cling to a high-tossed branch without screaming in fear. But there was something about the child which worried Tarzan. He often had watched the blacks within their village. He had seen the children playing, and always there had been much laughter, but little Go-Bu-Balu never laughed. It was true that Tarzan himself never laughed. Upon occasion he smiled grimly, but to laughter he was a stranger. The black, however, should have laughed, reasoned the ape-man. It was the way of the Gomangani. Also he saw that the little fellow often refused food and was growing thinner day by day. At times he surprised the boy sobbing softly to himself. Tarzan tried to comfort him, even as fierce Kala had comforted Tarzan when the ape-man was a balu, but all to no avail. Go-Bu-Balu merely no longer feared Tarzan, that was all. He feared every other living thing within the jungle. He feared the jungle days with their long excursions through the dizzy treetops. He feared the jungle nights with their swaying, perilous couches far above the ground and the grunting and coughing of the great carnivora prowling beneath him. Tarzan did not know what to do. His heritage of English blood rendered it a difficult thing even to consider a surrender of his project, though he was forced to admit to himself that his balu was not all that he had hoped. Though he was faithful to his self-imposed task, and even found that he had grown to like Go-Bu-Balu, he could not deceive himself into believing that he felt for it that fierce heat of passionate affection which Tika revealed for Gazan, and which the black mother had shown for Go-Bu-Balu. The little black boy, from cringing terror at the sight of Tarzan, passed by degrees into trustfulness and admiration. Only kindness had he ever received at the hands of the great white devil god, yet he had seen with what ferocity his kindly captor could deal with others. He had seen him leap upon a certain he-ape which persisted in attempting to seize and slay Go-Bu-Balu. He had seen the strong white teeth of the ape-man fastened in the neck of his adversary, and the mighty muscles tensed in battle. He had heard the savage, bestial snarls and roars of combat, and he had realized with a shudder that he could not differentiate between those of his guardian and those of his guardian and those of the hairy ape. He had seen Tarzan bring down a buck, just as Numa the lion might have done, leaping upon its back and fastening his fangs in the creature's neck. Tibo had shuddered at the sight, but he had thrilled too, and for the first time there entered his dull, negroid mind a vague desire to emulate his savage foster parent. But Tibo, the little black boy, lacked the divine spark which had permitted Tarzan, the white boy, to benefit by his training in the ways of the fierce jungle. In imagination he was wanting, and imagination is but another name for superintelligence. Imagination it is which builds bridges and cities and empires. The beasts know it not, the blacks only a little, while to 1 in 100,000 of Earth's dominant race it is given as a gift from heaven that man may not perish from the earth. While Tarzan pondered his problem concerning the future of his balu, fate was arranging to take the matter out of his hands. Mamaya, Tibo's mother, grief-stricken at the loss of her boy, had consulted the tribal witch doctor, but to no avail. The medicine he made was not good medicine, for though Mamaya paid him 2 goats for it, it did not bring back Tibo, nor even indicate where she might search for him with reasonable assurance of finding him. Mamaya, being of a short temper and of another people, had little respect for the witch doctor of her husband's tribe, and so when he suggested that a further payment of 2 more fat goats would doubtless enable him to make stronger medicine, she promptly loosed her shrewish tongue upon him. and with such good effect that he was glad to take himself off with his zebra's tail and his pot of magic. When he had gone and Mamaia had succeeded in partially subduing her anger, she gave herself over to thought, as she so often had done since the abduction of her Thibaut, in the hope that she finally might discover some feasible means of locating him, or at least assuring herself as to whether he were alive or dead. It was known to the blacks that Tarzan did not eat the flesh of man, for he had slain more than one of their number, yet never tasted the flesh of any. 2. The bodies always had been found, sometimes dropping as though from the clouds to alight in the center of the village. As Thibaut's body had not been found, Mamaia argued that he still lived, but where? Then it was that there came to her mind a recollection of Bukawai the unclean, who dwelt in a cave in the hillside to the north, and who it was well known entertained devils in his evil lair. Few, if any, had the temerity to visit old Bukawai, firstly because of fear of his black magic and the 2 hyenas who dwelt with him, and were commonly known to be devils masquerading, and secondly because of the loathsome disease which had caused Bukawai to be an outcast, a disease which was slowly eating away his face. Now it was that Mamaia reasoned shrewdly that if any might know the whereabouts of her Thibaut, it would be Bukawai, who was in friendly intercourse with gods and demons, since a demon or a god it was who had stolen her baby. But even her great mother love was sorely taxed to find the courage to send her forth into the black jungle toward the distant hills and the uncanny abode of Bukawai the unclean and his devils. Mother love, however, is one of the human passions which closely approximates to the dignity of an irresistible force. It drives the frail flesh of weak women to deeds of heroic measure. Mamaia was neither frail nor weak, physically, but she was a woman, an ignorant, superstitious African savage. She believed in devils, in black magic, and in witchcraft. To Mamaia, the jungle was inhabited by far more terrifying things than lions and leopards, horrifying, nameless things which possessed the power of wreaking frightful harm under various innocent guises. From one of the warriors of the village, whom she knew to have once stumbled upon the lair of Bukawai, the mother of Thibaut learned how she might find it near a spring of water, which rose in a small rocky canon between 2 hills, the easternmost of which was easily recognizable because of a huge granite boulder which rested upon its summit. The westerly hill was lower than its companion and was quite bare of vegetation except for a single mimosa tree, which grew just a little below its summit. These 2 hills, the man assured her, could be seen for some distance before she reached them, and together formed an excellent guide to her destination. He warned her, however, to abandon so foolish and dangerous an adventure, emphasizing what she already quite well knew, that if she escaped harm at the hands of Bukawai and his demons, the chances were that she would not be so fortunate with the great carnivora of the jungle through which she must pass going and returning. The warrior even went to Mamaia's husband, who, in turn, having little authority over the vixenish lady of his choice, went to Mbonga, the chief. The latter summoned Mamaia, threatening her with the direst punishment should she venture forth upon so unholy an excursion. The old chief's interest in the matter was due solely to that age-old alliance which exists between church and state. The local witch doctor, knowing his own medicine better than any other knew it, was jealous of all other pretenders to accomplishments in the black art. He long had heard of the power of Bukawai and feared lest, should he succeed in recovering Mamaia's lost child, much of the tribal patronage and consequent fees would be diverted to the unclean one. As Mbonga received as chief a certain proportion of the witch doctor's fees and could expect nothing from Bukawai, his heart and soul were, quite naturally, wrapped up in the Orthodox Church. But if Mamaia could view with intrepid heart an excursion into the jungle and a visit to the fear-haunted abode of Bukawai, she was not likely to be deterred by threats of future punishment at the hands of old Mbonga, whom she secretly despised. Yet she appeared to accede to his injunctions, returning to her hut in silence. She would have preferred starting upon her quest by daylight, but this was now out of the question, since she must carry food and a weapon of some sort, things which she never could pass out of the village with by day, without being subjected to curious questioning that surely would come immediately to the ears of Mbonga. So Mamaia bided her time until night, and just before the gates of the village were closed, she slipped through into the darkness and the jungle. She was much frightened, but she set her face resolutely toward the north, and though she paused often to listen breathlessly for the huge cats which here were her greatest terror, she nevertheless continued her way staunchly for several hours, until a low moan a little to her right and behind her brought her to a sudden stop. With palpitating heart the woman stood, scarce daring to breathe, and then, very faintly but unmistakable to her keen ears, came the stealthy crunching of twigs and grasses beneath padded feet. All about Mamaya grew the giant trees of the tropical jungle, festooned with hanging vines and mosses. She seized upon the nearest and started to clamber ape-like to the branches above. As she did so, there was a sudden rush of a great body behind her, a menacing roar that caused the earth to tremble, and something crashed into the very creepers to which she was clinging but below her. Mamaya drew herself to safety among the leafy branches and thanked the foresight which had prompted her to bring along the dried human ear which hung from a cord about her neck. She always had known that ear was good medicine. It had been given her, when a girl, by the witch doctor of her town tribe, and was nothing like the poor, weak medicine of Mbonga's witch doctor. All night Mamaya clung to her perch, for although the lion sought other prey after a short time, she dared not descend into the darkness again, for fear she might encounter him or another of his kind, but at daylight she clambered down and resumed her way. Tarzan of the apes, finding that his balu never ceased to give evidence of terror in the presence of the apes of the tribe, and also that most of the adult apes were a constant menace to Go Bubalu's life, so that Tarzan dared not leave him alone with them, took to hunting with the little black boy farther and farther from the stamping grounds of the anthropoids. Little by little his absences from the tribe grew in length as he wandered farther away from them, until finally he found himself a greater distance to the north than he ever before had hunted, and with water and ample game and fruit, he felt not at all inclined to return to the tribe. Little Go Bubalu gave evidences of a greater interest in life, an interest which varied in direct proportion to the distance he was from the apes of Kerchak. He now trotted along behind Tarzan when the ape-man went upon the ground, and in the trees he even did his best to follow his mighty foster parent. The boy was still sad and lonely. His thin little body had grown steadily thinner since he had come among the apes, for while as a young cannibal he was not over-nice in the matter of diet, he found it not always to his taste to stomach the weird things which tickled the palates of epicures among the apes. His large eyes were very large indeed now, his cheeks sunken, and every rib of his emaciated body plainly discernible to whomsoever should care to count them. Constant terror, perhaps, had had as much to do with his physical condition as had improper food. Tarzan noticed the change and was worried. He had hoped to see his balu wax sturdy and strong. His disappointment was great. In only one respect did Go Bubalu seem to progress. He readily was mastering the language of the apes. Even now he and Tarzan could converse in a fairly satisfactory manner by supplementing the meager ape speech with signs, but for the most part Go Bubalu was silent other than to answer questions put to him. His great sorrow was yet too new and too poignant to be laid aside even momentarily. Always he pined for Mamaya, shrewish, hideous, repulsive. Perhaps she would have been to you or me, but to Tibo she was Mama, the personification of that one great love which knows no selfishness and which does not consume itself in its own fires. As the two hunted, or rather as Tarzan hunted and Go Bubalu tagged along in his wake, the ape-man noticed many things and thought much. Once they came upon Saber moaning in the tall grasses. About her romped and played two little balls of fur, but her eyes were for one which lay between her great forepaws and did not romp, one who never would romp again. Tarzan read aright the anguish and the suffering of the huge mother cat. He had been minded to bait her. It was to do this that he had sneaked silently through the trees until he had come almost above her, but something held the ape-man as he saw the lioness grieving over her dead cub. With the acquisition of Go Bubalu, Tarzan had come to realize the responsibilities and sorrows of parentage. Without its joys, his heart went out to Saber as it might not have done a few weeks before. As he watched her, there rose quite unbidden before him a vision of Mamaya, the skewer through the septum of her nose, her pendulous under lip sagging beneath the weight which dragged it down. Tarzan saw not her unloveliness, he saw only the same anguish that was Saber's, and he winced. That strange functioning of the mind which sometimes is called association of ideas snapped Tika and Gazan before the ape-man's mental vision. What if one should come and take Gazan from Tika? Tarzan uttered a low and ominous growl as though Gazan were his own. Go Bubalu glanced here and there apprehensively, thinking that Tarzan had espied an enemy. Saber sprang suddenly to her feet, her yellow-green eyes blazing, her tail lashing as she cocked her ears, and raising her muzzle, sniffed the air for possible danger. The two little cubs which had been playing scampered quickly to her and, standing beneath her, peered out from between her forelegs, their big ears upstanding, their little heads cocked first upon one side and then upon the other. With a shake of his black shock, Tarzan turned away and resumed his hunting in another direction, but all day there rose one after another, above the threshold of his objective mind, memory portraits of Saber, of Momaya, and of Tika, a lioness, a cannibal, and a she-ape. Yet to the ape-man they were identical through motherhood. It was noon of the third day when Momaya came within sight of the cave of Bukawai the Unclean. The old witch doctor had rigged a framework of interlaced boughs to close the mouth of the cave from predatory beasts. This was now set to one side, and the black cavern beyond yawned mysterious and repellent. Momaya shivered as from a cold wind of the rainy season. No sign of life appeared about the cave, yet Momaya experienced that uncanny sensation as of unseen eyes regarding her malevolently. Again she shuddered. She tried to force her unwilling feet onward toward the cave, when from its depths issued an uncanny sound that was neither brute nor human, a weird sound that was akin to mirthless laughter. With a stifled scream, Momaya turned and fled into the jungle. For 100 yards she ran before she could control her terror, and then she paused, listening. Was all her labor, were all the terrors and dangers through which she had passed to go for naught? She tried to steel herself to return to the cave, but again fright overcame her. Saddened, disheartened, she turned slowly upon the back trail toward the village of Mbonga. Her young shoulders now were drooped like those of an old woman who bears a great burden of many years with their accumulated pains and sorrows, and she walked with tired feet and a halting step. The spring of youth was gone from Momaya. For another 100 yards she dragged her weary way, her brain half paralyzed from dumb terror and suffering. And then there came to her the memory of a little babe that suckled at her breast, and of a slim boy who romped, laughing, about her, and they were both Thibaut, her Thibaut, her Thibaut. Her shoulders straightened, she shook her savage head, and she turned about and walked boldly back to the mouth of the cave of Bukawai, the Unclean of Bukawai, the witch doctor. Again from the interior of the cave came the hideous laughter that was not laughter. This time Momaya recognized it for what it was, the strange cry of a hyena. No more did she shudder, but she held her spear ready and called aloud to Bukawai to come out. Instead of Bukawai came the repulsive head of a hyena. Momaya poked at it with her spear, and the ugly, sullen brute drew back with an angry growl. Again Momaya called Bukawai by name, and this time there came an answer in mumbling tones that were scarce more human than those of the beast. "Who comes to Bukawai?" queried the voice. "It is Momaya," replied the woman. "Momaya from the village of Mbonga, the chief." "What do you want?" "I want good medicine, better medicine than Mbonga's witch doctor can make," replied Momaya. "The great, white, jungle god has stolen my Thibaut, and I want medicine to bring him back, or to find where he is hidden that I may go and get him." "Who is Thibaut?" asked Bukawai. Momaya told him. "Bukawai's medicine is very strong," said the voice. 5 goats and a new sleeping mat are scarce enough in exchange for Bukawai's medicine." 2 goats are enough," said Momaya, "for the spirit of barter is strong in the breasts of the blacks." The pleasure of haggling over the price was a sufficiently potent lure to draw Bukawai to the mouth of the cave. Momaya was sorry when she saw him that he had not remained within. There are some things too horrible, too hideous, too repulsive for description. Bukawai's face was of these. When Momaya saw him, she understood why it was that he was almost inarticulate. Beside him were 2 hyenas, which rumor had said were his only and constant companions. They made an excellent trio, the most repulsive of beasts with the most repulsive of humans. 5 goats and a new sleeping mat, mumbled Bukawai. 2 fat goats and a sleeping mat. Momaya raised her bid, but Bukawai was obdurate. He stuck for the 5 goats and the sleeping mat for a matter of half an hour, while the hyenas sniffed and growled and laughed hideously. Momaya was determined to give all that Bukawai asked if she could do no better, but haggling is second nature to black barterers, and in the end it partly repaid her, for a compromise finally was reached which included 3 fat goats, a new sleeping mat, and a piece of copper wire. "Come back tonight," said Bukawai, "when the moon is 2 hours in the sky. Then will I make the strong medicine which shall bring Thibaut back to you. Bring with you the 3 fat goats, the new sleeping mat, and the piece of copper wire the length of a large man's forearm." "I cannot bring them," said Momaya. "You will have to come after them. When you have restored Thibaut to me, you shall have them all at the village of Mbonga." Bukawai shook his head. "I will make no medicine," he said, "until I have the goats and the mat and the copper wire." Momaya pleaded and threatened, but all to no avail. Finally she turned away and started off through the jungle toward the village of Mbonga. How she could get 3 goats and a sleeping mat out of the village and through the jungle to the cave of Bukawai. She did not know, but that she would do it. Somehow she was quite positive she would do it, or die. Tibo must be restored to her. Tarzan, coming lazily through the jungle with little Go-Bubalu, caught the scent of Bara, the deer. Tarzan hungered for the flesh of Bara. Naught tickled his palate so greatly, but to stalk Bara with Go-Balu at his heels was out of the question, so he hid the child in the crotch of a tree, where the thick foliage screened him from view, and set off swiftly and silently upon the spoor of Bara. Tibo alone was more terrified than Tibo even among the apes. Real and apparent dangers are less disconcerting than those which we imagine, and only the gods of his people knew how much Tibo imagined. He had been but a short time in his hiding place when he heard something approaching through the jungle. He crouched closer to the limb upon which he lay and prayed that Tarzan would return quickly. His wide eyes searched the jungle in the direction of the moving creature. What if it was a leopard that had caught his scent? It would be upon him in a minute. Hot tears flowed from the large eyes of little Tibo. The curtain of jungle foliage rustled close at hand. The thing was but a few paces from his tree. His eyes fairly popped from his black face as he watched for the appearance of the dread creature which presently would thrust a snarling countenance from between the vines and creepers. And then the curtain parted and a woman stepped into full view. With a gasping cry, Tibo tumbled from his perch and raced toward her. Mamaya suddenly started back and raised her spear, but a second later she cast it aside and caught the thin body in her strong arms. Crushing it to her, she cried and laughed all at one and the same time, and hot tears of joy, mingled with the tears of Tibo, trickled down the crease between her naked breasts. Disturbed by the noise so close at hand, there arose from his sleep in a nearby thicket Numa, the lion. He looked through the tangled underbrush and saw the black woman and her young. He licked his chops and measured the distance between them and himself. A short charge and a long leap would carry him upon them. He flicked the end of his tail and sighed. A vagrant breeze, swirling suddenly in the wrong direction, carried the scent of Tarzan to the sensitive nostrils of Bara the deer. There was a startled tensing of muscles and cocking of ears, a sudden dash, and Tarzan's meat was gone. The ape-man angrily shook his head and turned back toward the spot where he had left Go-Bubalu. He came softly as was his way. Before he reached the spot he heard strange sounds, the sound of a woman laughing and of a woman weeping, and the two which seemed to come from one throat were mingled with the convulsive sobbing of a child. Tarzan hastened, and when Tarzan hastened, only the birds and the wind went faster. And as Tarzan approached the sounds, he heard another, a deep sigh. Mamaya did not hear it, nor did Tibo, but the ears of Tarzan were as the ears of Bara, the deer. He heard the sigh, and he knew, so he unloosed the heavy spear which dangled at his back. Even as he sped through the branches of the trees, with the same ease that you or I might take out a pocket handkerchief as we strolled nonchalantly down a lazy country lane, Tarzan of the apes took the spear from its thong that it might be ready against any emergency. Numa, the lion, did not rush madly to attack. He reasoned again, and reason told him that already the prey was his, so he pushed his great bulk through the foliage and stood eyeing his meat with baleful, glaring eyes. Mamaya saw him and shrieked, drawing Tibo closer to her breast. To have found her child and to lose him, all in a moment. She raised her spear, throwing her hand far back of her shoulder. Numa roared and stepped slowly forward. Mamaya cast her weapon. It grazed the tawny shoulder, inflicting a flesh wound which aroused all the terrific bestiality of the carnivore, and the lion charged. Mamaya tried to close her eyes but could not. She saw the flashing swiftness of the huge oncoming death, and then she saw something else. She saw a mighty, naked white man drop, as from the heavens into the path of the charging lion. She saw the muscles of a great arm flash in the light of the equatorial sun as it filtered, dappling through the foliage above. She saw a heavy hunting spear hurtle through the air to meet the lion in mid-leap. Numa brought up upon his haunches, roaring terribly and striking at the spear which protruded from his breast. His great blows bent and twisted the weapon. Tarzan, crouching and with hunting knife in hand, circled warily about the frenzied cat. Mamaya, wide-eyed, stood rooted to the spot, watching, fascinated. In sudden fury Numa hurled himself toward the ape-man, but the wiry creature eluded the blundering charge, sidestepping quickly only to rush in upon his foe. Twice the hunting blade flashed in the air. Twice it fell upon the back of Numa, already weakening from the spear point so near his heart. The second stroke of the blade pierced far into the beast's spine, and with a last convulsive sweep of the forepaws, in a vain attempt to reach his tormentor, Numa sprawled upon the ground, paralyzed and dying. Bukawai, fearful lest he should lose any recompense, followed Mamaya with the intention of persuading her to part with her ornaments of copper and iron against her return with the price of the medicine to pay, as it were, for an option on his services as one pays a retaining fee to an attorney. 4. Like an attorney, Bukawai knew the value of his medicine, and that it was well to collect as much as possible in advance. The witch doctor came upon the scene as Tarzan leaped to meet the lion's charge. He saw it all and marveled, guessing immediately that this must be the strange white demon concerning whom he had heard vague rumors before Mamaya came to him. Mamaya, now that the lion was past harming her or hers, gazed with new terror upon Tarzan. It was he who had stolen her Tibo. Doubtless he would attempt to steal him again. Mamaya hugged the boy close to her. She was determined to die this time rather than suffer Tibo to be taken from her again. Tarzan eyed them in silence. The sight of the boy clinging, sobbing to his mother aroused within his savage breast a melancholy loneliness. There was none thus to cling to Tarzan, who yearned so for the love of someone, of something. At last Tibo looked up because of the quiet that had fallen upon the jungle, and saw Tarzan. He did not shrink. "Tarzan," he said, in the speech of the great apes of the tribe of Kerchak, "do not take me from Mamaya, my mother. Do not take me again to the lair of the hairy tree men, for I fear Tog and Gunto and the others. Let me stay with Mamaya, O Tarzan, god of the jungle. Let me stay with Mamaya, my mother. And to the end of our days we will bless you and put food before the gates of the village of Mbonga that you may never hunger." Tarzan sighed. "Go," he said, "back to the village of Mbonga, and Tarzan will follow to see that no harm befalls you." Tibo translated the words to his mother, and the two turned their backs upon the ape-man and started off toward home. In the heart of Mamaya was a great fear and a great exultation, for never before had she walked with God, and never had she been so happy. She strained little Tibo to her, stroking his thin cheek. Tarzan saw and sighed again. "For Tika there is Tika's Balu," he soliloquized, "for Saber there are Balis, and for the Shigomangani, and for Bara, and for Manu, and even for Pamba the rat, but for Tarzan there can be none, neither a she nor a Balu. Tarzan of the apes is a man, and it must be that man walks alone." Bukawai saw them go, and he mumbled through his rotting face, swearing a great oath that he would yet have the 3 fat goats, the new sleeping mat, and the bit of copper wire. Chapter 6. The Witch Doctor Seeks Vengeance. Lord Greystoke was hunting, or to be more accurate, he was shooting pheasants at Chamston Heading. Lord Greystoke was immaculately and appropriately garbed to the minutest detail. He was vogue. To be sure, he was among the forward guns, not being considered a sporting shot, but what he lacked in skill he more than made up in appearance. At the end of the day he would, doubtless, have many birds to his credit, since he had 2 guns and a smart loader, many more birds than he could eat in a year, even had he been hungry, which he was not, having but just arisen from the breakfast table. The beaters, there were 23 of them, in white smocks, had but just driven the birds into a patch of gorse, and were now circling to the opposite side that they might drive down toward the guns. Lord Greystoke was quite as excited as he ever permitted himself to become. There was an exhilaration in the sport that would not be denied. He felt his blood tingling through his veins as the beaters approached closer and closer to the birds. In a vague and stupid sort of way, Lord Greystoke felt, as he always felt upon such occasions, that he was experiencing a sensation somewhat akin to a reversion to a prehistoric type, that the blood of an ancient forebear was coursing hot through him, a hairy, half-naked forebear who had lived by the hunt. And far away in a matted equatorial jungle another Lord Greystoke, the real Lord Greystoke, hunted. By the standards which he knew, he too was vogue, utterly vogue, as was the primal ancestor before the first eviction. The day being sultry, the leopard skin had been left behind. The real Lord Greystoke had not 2 guns, to be sure, nor even 1, neither did he have a smart loader, but he possessed something infinitely more efficacious than guns, or loaders, or even 23 beaters in white smocks. He possessed an appetite, an uncanny woodcraft, and muscles that were as steel springs. Later that day in England, a Lord Greystoke ate bountifully of things he had not killed, and he drank other things which were uncorked to the accompaniment of much noise. He patted his lips with snowy linen to remove the faint traces of his repast, quite ignorant of the fact that he was an impostor, and that the rightful owner of his noble title was even then finishing his own dinner in far-off Africa. He was not using snowy linen, though. Instead, he drew the back of a brown forearm and hand across his mouth and wiped his bloody fingers upon his thighs. Then he moved slowly through the jungle to the drinking place, where upon all fours he drank as drank his fellows, the other beasts of the jungle. As he quenched his thirst, another denizen of the gloomy forest approached the stream along the path behind him. It was Numa the lion, tawny of body and black of mane, scowling and sinister, rumbling out low, coughing roars. Tarzan of the apes heard him long before he came within sight, but the ape-man went on with his drinking until he had had his fill. Then he arose, slowly, with the easy grace of a creature of the wilds and all the quiet dignity that was his birthright. Numa halted as he saw the man standing at the very spot where the king would drink. His jaws were parted, and his cruel eyes gleamed. He growled and advanced slowly. The man growled too, backing slowly to one side and watching not the lion's face but its tail. Should that commence to move from side to side in quick, nervous jerks, it would be well to be upon the alert, and should it rise suddenly erect, straight and stiff, then one might prepare to fight or flee, but it did neither. So Tarzan merely backed away, and the lion came down and drank scarce 50 feet from where the man stood. Tomorrow they might be at one another's throats, but today there existed one of those strange and inexplicable truces which so often are seen among the savage ones of the jungle. Before Numa had finished drinking, Tarzan had returned into the forest and was swinging away in the direction of the village of Mbonga, the Black Chief. It had been at least a moon since the ape-man had called upon the Gomangani. Not since he had restored little Tibo to his grief-stricken mother had the whim seized him to do so. The incident of the adopted Balu was a closed one to Tarzan. He had sought to find something upon which to lavish such an affection as Tika lavished upon her Balu, but a short experience of the little black boy had made it quite plain to the ape-man that no such sentiment could exist between them. The fact that he had for a time treated the little black as he might have treated a real Balu of his own had in no way altered the vengeful sentiments with which he considered the murderers of Kala. The Gomangani were his deadly enemies, nor could they ever be aught else. Today he looked forward to some slight relief from the monotony of his existence in such excitement as he might derive from baiting the blacks. It was not yet dark when he reached the village and took his place in the great tree overhanging the palisade. From beneath came a great wailing out of the depths of a nearby hut. The noise fell disagreeably upon Tarzan's ears. It jarred and grated. He did not like it, so he decided to go away for a while in the hopes that it might cease, but though he was gone for a couple of hours, the wailing still continued when he returned. With the intention of putting a violent termination to the annoying sound, Tarzan slipped silently from the tree into the shadows beneath. Creeping stealthily and keeping well in the cover of other huts, he approached that from which rose the sounds of lamentation. A fire burned brightly before the doorway as it did before other doorways in the village. A few females squatted about, occasionally adding their own mournful howlings to those of the master artist within. The ape-man smiled a slow smile as he thought of the consternation which would follow the quick leap that would carry him among the females and into the full light of the fire. Then he would dart into the hut during the excitement, throttle the chief screamer, and be gone into the jungle before the blacks could gather their scattered nerves for an assault. Many times had Tarzan behaved similarly in the village of Mbonga, the chief. His mysterious and unexpected appearances always filled the breasts of the poor, superstitious blacks with the panic of terror. Never, it seemed, could they accustom themselves to the sight of him. It was this terror which lent to the adventures the spice of interest and amusement which the human mind of the ape-man craved. Merely to kill was not in itself sufficient. Accustomed to the sight of death, Tarzan found no great pleasure in it. Long since had he avenged the death of Kala, but in the accomplishment of it he had learned the excitement and the pleasure to be derived from the baiting of the blacks. Of this he never tired. It was just as he was about to spring forward with a savage roar that a figure appeared in the doorway of the hut. It was the figure of the wailer whom he had come to still, the figure of a young woman with a wooden skewer through the split septum of her nose, with a heavy metal ornament depending from her lower lip, which it had dragged down to hideous and repulsive deformity. With strange tattooing upon forehead, cheeks, and breasts, and a wonderful coiffure built up with mud and wire. A sudden flare of the fire threw the grotesque figure into high relief, and Tarzan recognized her as Momaya, the mother of Tibo. The fire also threw out a fitful flame which carried to the shadows where Tarzan lurked, picking out his light brown body from the surrounding darkness. Momaya saw him and knew him. With a cry, she leaped forward and Tarzan came to meet her. The other women, turning, saw him too, but they did not come toward him. Instead, they rose as one, shrieked as one, fled as one. Mamaya threw herself at Tarzan's feet, raising supplicating hands toward him and pouring forth from her mutilated lips a perfect cataract of words, not one of which the ape-man comprehended. For a moment he looked down upon the upturned, frightful face of the woman. He had come to slay, but that overwhelming torrent of speech filled him with consternation and with awe. He glanced about him apprehensively, then back at the woman. A revulsion of feeling seized him. He could not kill little Thibault's mother, nor could he stand and face this verbal geyser. With a quick gesture of impatience at the spoiling of his evening's entertainment, he wheeled and leaped away into the darkness. A moment later he was swinging through the black jungle night, the cries and lamentations of Mamaya growing fainter in the distance. It was with a sigh of relief that he finally reached a point from which he could no longer hear them, and finding a comfortable crotch high among the trees, composed himself for a night of dreamless slumber, while a prowling lion moaned and coughed beneath him. And in far-off England the other Lord Greystoke, with the assistance of a valet, disrobed and crawled between spotless sheets, swearing irritably as a cat meowed beneath his window. As Tarzan followed the fresh spoor of Horta, the boar, the following morning he came upon the tracks of two Gomangani, a large one and a small one. The ape-man, accustomed as he was to questioning closely all that fell to his perceptions, paused to read the story written in the soft mud of the game trail. You or I would have seen little of interest there, even if, by chance, we could have seen aught. Perhaps had one been there to point them out to us, we might have noted indentations in the mud, but there were countless indentations, one overlapping another into a confusion that would have been entirely meaningless to us. To Tarzan each told its own story. Tantor, the elephant, had passed that way as recently as 3 suns since. Numa had hunted here the night just gone, and Horta, the boar, had walked slowly along the trail within an hour. But what held Tarzan's attention was the spoor tale of the Gomangani. It told him that the day before an old man had gone toward the north in company with a little boy, and that with them had been 2 hyenas. Tarzan scratched his head in puzzled incredulity. He could see by the overlapping of the footprints that the beasts had not been following the 2, for sometimes one was ahead of them and one behind, and again both were in advance or both were in the rear. It was very strange and quite inexplicable, especially where the spoor showed where the hyenas in the wider portions of the path had walked one on either side of the human pair, quite close to them. Then Tarzan rayed in the spoor of the smaller Gomangani, a shrinking terror of the beast that brushed his side, but in that of the old man was no sign of fear. At first Tarzan had been solely occupied by the remarkable juxtaposition of the spoor of Dango and Gomangani, but now his keen eyes caught something in the spoor of the little Gomangani, which brought him to a sudden stop. It was as though, finding a letter in the road, you suddenly had discovered in it the familiar handwriting of a friend. "Go Bubalu," exclaimed the ape-man, and at once memory flashed upon the screen of recollection the supplicating attitude of Mamaya as she had hurled herself before him in the village of Mbonga the night before. Instantly all was explained: the wailing and lamentation, the pleading of the black mother, the sympathetic howling of the shes about the fire. Little Go Bubalu had been stolen again, and this time by another than Tarzan. Doubtless the mother had thought that he was again in the power of Tarzan of the Apes, and she had been beseeching him to return her balu to her. Yes, it was all quite plain now, but who could have stolen Go Bubalu this time? Tarzan wondered, and he wondered too about the presence of Dango. He would investigate. The spoor was a day old, and it ran toward the north. Tarzan set out to follow it. In places it was totally obliterated by the passage of many beasts, and where the way was rocky even Tarzan of the Apes was almost baffled, but there was still the faint effluvium which clung to the human spoor, appreciable only to such highly trained perceptive powers as were Tarzan's. It had all happened to little Thibault very suddenly and unexpectedly within the brief span of 2 suns. First had come Bukarwai, the witch doctor Bukarwai the unclean, with the ragged bit of flesh which still clung to his rotting face. He had come alone, and by day to the place at the river where Mamaya went daily to wash her body and that of Thibault, her little boy. He had stepped out from behind a great bush quite close to Mamaya, frightening little Thibault so that he ran screaming to his mother's protecting arms. But Mamaya, though startled, had wheeled to face the fearsome thing with all the savage ferocity of a she-tiger at bay. When she saw who it was, she breathed a sigh of partial relief, though she still clung tightly to Thibault. "I have come," said Bukarwai without preliminary, "for the 3 fat goats, the new sleeping mat, and the bit of copper wire as long as a tall man's arm." "I have no goats for you," snapped Mamaya, "nor a sleeping mat, nor any wire. Your medicine was never made. The white jungle god gave me back my Tibo. You had nothing to do with it. But I did, mumbled Bukawai through his fleshless jaws. It was I who commanded the white jungle god to give back your Tibo. Mamaya laughed in his face. Speaker of lies, she cried, go back to your foul den and your hyenas. Go back and hide your stinking face in the belly of the mountain, lest the sun, seeing it, cover his face with a black cloud. I have come, reiterated Bukawai, for the 3 fat goats, the new sleeping mat, and the bit of copper wire the length of a tall man's arm, which you were to pay me for the return of your Tibo. It was to be the length of a man's forearm, corrected Mamaya, but you shall have nothing, old thief. You would not make medicine until I had brought the payment in advance, and when I was returning to my village the great white jungle god gave me back my Tibo, gave him to me out of the jaws of Numa. His medicine is true medicine, yours is the weak medicine of an old man with a hole in his face. I have come, repeated Bukawai patiently, for the 3 fat, but Mamaya had not waited to hear more of what she already knew by heart. Clasping Tibo close to her side, she was hurrying away toward the palisaded village of Mbonga, the chief. And the next day, when Mamaya was working in the plantain field with others of the women of the tribe, and little Tibo had been playing at the edge of the jungle, casting a small spear in anticipation of the distant day when he should be a full-fledged warrior, Bukawai had come again. Tibo had seen a squirrel scampering up the bole of a great tree. His childish mind had transformed it into the menacing figure of a hostile warrior. Little Tibo had raised his tiny spear, his heart filled with the savage bloodlust of his race, as he pictured the night's orgy when he should dance about the corpse of his human kill, as the women of his tribe prepared the meat for the feast to follow. But when he cast the spear, he missed both squirrel and tree, losing his missile far among the tangled undergrowth of the jungle. However, it could be but a few steps within the forbidden labyrinth. The women were all about in the field. There were warriors on guard within easy hail, and so little Tibo boldly ventured into the dark place. Just behind the screen of creepers and matted foliage lurked 3 horrid figures, an old man black as the pit, with a face half-eaten away by leprosy, his sharp-filed teeth, the teeth of a cannibal, showing yellow and repulsive through the great gaping hole where his mouth and nose had been. And beside him, equally hideous, stood 2 powerful hyenas carrion-eaters consorting with carrion. Tibo did not see them until, head down, he had forced his way through the thickly growing vines in search of his little spear. And then it was too late. As he looked up into the face of Bukawai, the old witch doctor seized him, muffling his screams with a palm across his mouth. Tibo struggled futilely. A moment later he was being hustled away through the dark and terrible jungle, the frightful old man still muffling his screams, and the 2 hideous hyenas pacing now on either side, now before, now behind, always prowling, always growling, snapping, snarling, or worst of all, laughing hideously. To little Tibo, who within his brief existence had passed through such experiences as are given to few to pass through in a lifetime, the northward journey was a nightmare of terror. He thought now of the time that he had been with the great white jungle god, and he prayed with all his little soul that he might be back again with the white-skinned giant who consorted with the hairy tree men. Terror-stricken he had been then, but his surroundings had been nothing by comparison with those which he now endured. The old man seldom addressed Tibo, though he kept up an almost continuous mumbling throughout the long day. Tibo caught repeated references to fat goats, sleeping mats, and pieces of copper wire. 10 fat goats, 10 fat goats, the old Negro would croon over and over again. By this little Tibo guessed that the price of his ransom had risen. 10 fat goats? Where would his mother get 10 fat goats, or thin ones either for that matter, to buy back just a poor little boy? Mbonga would never let her have them, and Tibo knew that his father never had owned more than 3 goats at the same time in all his life. 10 fat goats, Tibo sniffled. The putrid old man would kill him and eat him, for the goats would never be forthcoming. Bukawai would throw his bones to the hyenas. The little black boy shuddered and became so weak that he almost fell in his tracks. Bukawai cuffed him on an ear and jerked him along. After what seemed an eternity to Tibo, they arrived at the mouth of a cave between 2 rocky hills. The opening was low and narrow. A few saplings bound together with strips of rawhide closed it against stray beasts. Bukawai removed the primitive door and pushed Tibo within. The hyenas, snarling, rushed past him and were lost to view in the blackness of the interior. Bukawai replaced the saplings and, seizing Tibo roughly by the arm, dragged him along a narrow, rocky passage. The floor was comparatively smooth, for the dirt which lay thick upon it had been trodden and tramped by many feet until few inequalities remained. The passage was tortuous, and as it was very dark and the walls rough and rocky, Thibaut was scratched and bruised from the many bumps he received. Bukawai walked as rapidly through the winding gallery as one would traverse a familiar lane by daylight. He knew every twist and turn as a mother knows the face of her child, and he seemed to be in a hurry. He jerked poor little Thibaut possibly a trifle more ruthlessly than necessary even at the pace Bukawai set, but the old witch doctor, an outcast from the society of man, diseased, shunned, hated, feared, was far from possessing an angelic temper. Nature had given him few of the kindlier characteristics of man, and these few fate had eradicated entirely. Shrewd, cunning, cruel, vindictive was Bukawai the witch doctor. Frightful tales were whispered of the cruel tortures he inflicted upon his victims. Children were frightened into obedience by the threat of his name. Often had Thibaut been thus frightened, and now he was reaping a grisly harvest of terror from the seeds his mother had innocently sown. The darkness, the presence of the dreaded witch doctor, the pain of the contusions, with a haunting premonition of the future, and the fear of the hyenas combined to almost paralyze the child. He stumbled and reeled until Bukawai was dragging rather than leading him. Presently Thibaut saw a faint lightness ahead of them, and a moment later they emerged into a roughly circular chamber to which a little daylight filtered through a rift in the rocky ceiling. The hyenas were there ahead of them, waiting. As Bukawai entered with Thibaut, the beasts slunk toward them, baring yellow fangs. They were hungry. Toward Thibaut they came, and one snapped at his naked legs. Bukawai seized a stick from the floor of the chamber and struck a vicious blow at the beast, at the same time mumbling forth a volley of execrations. The hyena dodged and ran to the side of the chamber, where he stood growling. Bukawai took a step toward the creature, which bristled with rage at his approach. Fear and hatred shot from its evil eyes, but fortunately for Bukawai, fear predominated. Seeing that he was unnoticed, the second beast made a short, quick rush for Thibaut. The child screamed and darted after the witch doctor, who now turned his attention to the second hyena. This one he reached with his heavy stick, striking it repeatedly and driving it to the wall. There, the two carrion eaters commenced to circle the chamber, while the human carrion, their master, now in a perfect frenzy of demoniacal rage, ran to and fro in an effort to intercept them, striking out with his cudgel and lashing them with his tongue, calling down upon them the curses of whatever gods and demons he could summon to memory, and describing in lurid figures the ignominy of their ancestors. Several times one or the other of the beasts would turn to make a stand against the witch doctor, and then Thibaut would hold his breath in agonized terror, for never in his brief life had he seen such frightful hatred depicted upon the countenance of man or beast. But always fear overcame the rage of the savage creatures, so that they resumed their flight, snarling and bare-fanged, just at the moment that Thibaut was certain they would spring at Bukawai's throat. At last the witch doctor tired of the futile chase. With a snarl quite as bestial as those of the beast, he turned toward Thibaut. "I go to collect the 10 fat goats, the new sleeping mat, and the 2 pieces of copper wire that your mother will pay for the medicine I shall make to bring you back to her," he said. "You will stay here, there." And he pointed toward the passage which they had followed to the chamber. "I will leave the hyenas. If you try to escape, they will eat you." He cast aside the stick and called to the beasts. They came, snarling and slinking, their tails between their legs. Bukawai led them to the passage and drove them into it. Then he dragged a rude lattice into place before the opening after he, himself, had left the chamber. "This will keep them from you," he said. "If I do not get the 10 fat goats and the other things, they shall at least have a few bones after I am through," and he left the boy to think over the meaning of his all too suggestive words. When he was gone, Thibaut threw himself upon the earth floor and broke into childish sobs of terror and loneliness. He knew that his mother had no 10 fat goats to give, and that when Bukawai returned, little Thibaut would be killed and eaten. How long he lay there he did not know, but presently he was aroused by the growling of the hyenas. They had returned through the passage and were glaring at him from beyond the lattice. He could see their yellow eyes blazing through the darkness. They reared up and clawed at the barrier. Thibaut shivered and withdrew to the opposite side of the chamber. He saw the lattice sag and sway to the attacks of the beasts. Momentarily he expected that it would fall inward, letting the creatures upon him. Warily the horror-ridden hours dragged their slow way. Night came, and for a time Thibaut slept, but it seemed that the hungry beasts never slept. Always they stood just beyond the lattice, growling their hideous growls or laughing their hideous laughs. Through the narrow rift in the rocky roof above him, Thibaut could see a few stars, and once the moon crossed. At last daylight came again. Thibaut was very hungry and thirsty, for he had not eaten since the morning before, and only once upon the long march had he been permitted to drink, but even hunger and thirst were almost forgotten in the terror of his position. It was after daylight that the child discovered a second opening in the walls of the subterranean chamber, almost opposite that at which the hyenas still stood glaring hungrily at him. It was only a narrow slit in the rocky wall. It might lead in but a few feet, or it might lead to freedom. Thibaut approached it and looked within. He could see nothing. He extended his arm into the blackness, but he dared not venture farther. Bukawai never would have left open a way of escape, Thibaut reasoned, so this passage must lead either nowhere or to some still more hideous danger. To the boy's fear of the actual dangers which menaced him, Bukawai and the two hyenas, his superstition added countless others quite too horrible even to name, for in the lives of the blacks, through the shadows of the jungle day and the black horrors of the jungle night, flit strange, fantastic shapes peopling the already hideously peopled forests with menacing figures, as though the lion and the leopard, the snake and the hyena, and the countless poisonous insects were not quite sufficient to strike terror to the hearts of the poor. Simple creatures whose lot is cast in earth's most fearsome spot. And so it was that little Thibaut cringed not only from real menaces but from imaginary ones. He was afraid even to venture upon a road that might lead to escape, lest Bukawai had set to watch it some frightful demon of the jungle. But the real menaces suddenly drove the imaginary ones from the boy's mind, for with the coming of daylight the half-famished hyenas renewed their efforts to break down the frail barrier which kept them from their prey. Rearing upon their hind feet they clawed and struck at the lattice. With wide eyes Thibaut saw it sag and rock. Not for long, he knew, could it withstand the assaults of these two powerful and determined brutes. Already one corner had been forced past the rocky protuberance of the entranceway which had held it in place. A shaggy forearm protruded into the chamber. Thibaut trembled as with ague, for he knew that the end was near. Backing against the farther wall, he stood flattened out as far from the beasts as he could get. He saw the lattice give still more. He saw a savage, snarling head force past it, and grinning jaws snapping and gaping toward him. In another instant the pitiful fabric would fall inward, and the two would be upon him, rending his flesh from his bones, gnawing the bones themselves, fighting for possession of his entrails. Bukawai came upon Mamaya outside the palisade of Mbonga, the chief. At sight of him the woman drew back in revulsion. Then she flew at him tooth and nail, but Bukawai, threatening her with a spear, held her at a safe distance. "Where is my baby?" she cried. "Where is my little Thibaut?" Bukawai opened his eyes in well-simulated amazement. "Your baby," he exclaimed. "What should I know of him, other than that I rescued him from the white god of the jungle and have not yet received my pay? I come for the goats and the sleeping mat and the piece of copper wire the length of a tall man's arm from the shoulder to the tips of his fingers." Offal of a hyena, shrieked Mamaya. "My child has been stolen, and you, rotting fragment of a man, have taken him. Return him to me, or I shall tear your eyes from your head and feed your heart to the wild hogs." Bukawai shrugged his shoulders. "What do I know about your child?" he asked. "I have not taken him. If he is stolen again, what should Bukawai know of the matter? Did Bukawai steal him before? No, the white jungle god stole him. And if he stole him once, he would steal him again. It is nothing to me. I returned him to you before, and I have come for my pay. If he is gone and you would have him returned, Bukawai will return him for 10 fat goats. A new sleeping mat and 2 pieces of copper wire the length of a tall man's arm from the shoulder to the tips of his fingers, and Bukawai will say nothing more about the goats and the sleeping mat and the copper wire which you were to pay for the first medicine." 10 fat goats," screamed Mamaya. "I could not pay you 10 fat goats in as many years. 10 fat goats indeed." 10 fat goats," repeated Bukawai. 10 fat goats, the new sleeping mat, and 2 pieces of copper wire the length of. Mamaya stopped him with an impatient gesture. "Wait," she cried. "I have no goats. You waste your breath. Stay here while I go to my man. He has but 3 goats, yet something may be done. Wait." Bukawai sat down beneath a tree. He felt quite content, for he knew that he should have either payment or revenge. He did not fear harm at the hands of these people of another tribe, although he well knew that they must fear and hate him. His leprosy alone would prevent their laying hands upon him, while his reputation as a witch doctor rendered him doubly immune from attack. He was planning upon compelling them to drive the 10 goats to the mouth of his cave when Mamaya returned. With her were 3 warriors: Mbonga, the chief Rabakega, the village witch doctor, and Ibeto, Thibaut's father. They were not pretty men even under ordinary circumstances, and now, with their faces marked by anger, they well might have inspired terror in the heart of anyone, but if Bukawai felt any fear, he did not betray it. Instead, he greeted them with an insolent stare, intended to awe them, as they came and squatted in a semicircle before him. "Where is Ebeto's son?" asked Mbonga. "How should I know?" returned Bukawai. "Doubtless the white devil god has him. If I am paid, I will make strong medicine, and then we shall know where is Ebeto's son, and shall get him back again. It was my medicine which got him back the last time, for which I got no pay." "I have my own witch doctor to make medicine," replied Mbonga, with dignity. Bukawai sneered and rose to his feet. "Very well," he said, "let him make his medicine and see if he can bring Ebeto's son back." He took a few steps away from them, and then he turned angrily back. "His medicine will not bring the child back, that I know, and I also know that when you find him it will be too late for any medicine to bring him back, for he will be dead. This have I just found out, the ghost of my father's sister but now came to me and told me." Now, Mbonga and Rabakega might not take much stock in their own magic, and they might even be skeptical as to the magic of another, but there was always a chance of something being in it, especially if it were not their own. Was it not well known that old Bukawai had speech with the demons themselves, and that two even lived with him in the forms of hyenas? Still, they must not exceed too hastily. There was the price to be considered, and Mbonga had no intention of parting lightly with 10 goats to obtain the return of a single little boy who might die of smallpox long before he reached a warrior's estate. "Wait," said Mbonga. "Let us see some of your magic, that we may know if it be good magic. Then we can talk about payment. Rabakega will make some magic too. We will see who makes the best magic. Sit down, Bukawai. The payment will be 10 goats, fat goats, a new sleeping mat, and 2 pieces of copper wire the length of a tall man's arm from the shoulder to the ends of his fingers, and it will be made in advance, the goats being driven to my cave. Then will I make the medicine. And on the 2nd day the boy will be returned to his mother. It cannot be done more quickly than that, because it takes time to make such strong medicine." "Make us some medicine now," said Mbonga. "Let us see what sort of medicine you make." "Bring me fire," replied Bukawai, "and I will make you a little magic." Mamaya was dispatched for the fire, and while she was away Mbonga dickered with Bukawai about the price. 10 goats, he said, was a high price for an able-bodied warrior. He also called Bukawai's attention to the fact that he, Mbonga, was very poor, that his people were very poor, and that 10 goats were at least 8 too many, to say nothing of a new sleeping mat and the copper wire, but Bukawai was adamant. His medicine was very expensive, and he would have to give at least 5 goats to the gods who helped him make it. They were still arguing when Mamaya returned with the fire. Bukawai placed a little on the ground before him, took a pinch of powder from a pouch at his side and sprinkled it on the embers. A cloud of smoke rose with a puff. Bukawai closed his eyes and rocked back and forth. Then he made a few passes in the air and pretended to swoon. Mbonga and the others were much impressed. Rabakega grew nervous. He saw his reputation waning. There was some fire left in the vessel which Mamaya had brought. He seized the vessel, dropped a handful of dry leaves into it while no one was watching, and then uttered a frightful scream which drew the attention of Bukawai's audience to him. It also brought Bukawai quite miraculously out of his swoon, but when the old witch doctor saw the reason for the disturbance, he quickly relapsed into unconsciousness before anyone discovered his faux pas. Rabakega, seeing that he had the attention of Mbonga, Ebeto, and Mamaya, blew suddenly into the vessel, with the result that the leaves commenced to smolder, and smoke issued from the mouth of the receptacle. Rabakega was careful to hold it so that none might see the dry leaves. Their eyes opened wide at this remarkable demonstration of the village witch doctor's powers. The latter, greatly elated, let himself out. He shouted, jumped up and down, and made frightful grimaces. Then he put his face close over the mouth of the vessel and appeared to be communing with the spirits within. It was while he was thus engaged that Bukawai came out of his trance, his curiosity finally having gotten the better of him. No one was paying him the slightest attention. He blinked his one eye angrily, then he too let out a loud roar, and when he was sure that Mbonga had turned toward him, he stiffened rigidly and made spasmodic movements with his arms and legs. "I see him," he cried. "He is far away. The white devil god did not get him. He is alone and in great danger," but he added, "If the 10 fat goats and the other things are paid to me quickly, there is yet time to save him." Rabakega had paused to listen. Mbonga looked toward him. The chief was in a quandary. He did not know which medicine was the better. What does your magic tell you? He asked of Rabakega. I too see him, screamed Rabakega, but he is not where Bukawai says he is. He is dead at the bottom of the river. At this, Mamaya commenced to howl loudly. Tarzan had followed the spoor of the old man, the two hyenas, and the little black boy to the mouth of the cave in the rocky canon between the two hills. Here he paused a moment before the sapling barrier which Bukawai had set up, listening to the snarls and growls which came faintly from the far recesses of the cavern. Presently, mingled with the beastly cries that came faintly to the keen ears of the ape-man, the agonized moan of a child. No longer did Tarzan hesitate. Hurling the door aside, he sprang into the dark opening. Narrow and black was the corridor, but long use of his eyes and the Stygian blackness of the jungle nights had given to the ape-man something of the nocturnal visionary powers of the wild things with which he had consorted since babyhood. He moved rapidly and yet with caution, for the place was dark, unfamiliar and winding. As he advanced, he heard more and more loudly the savage snarls of the two hyenas, mingled with the scraping and scratching of their paws upon wood. The moans of a child grew in volume, and Tarzan recognized in them the voice of the little black boy he once had sought to adopt as his balu. There was no hysteria in the ape-man's advance. Too accustomed was he to the passing of life in the jungle to be greatly wrought even by the death of one whom he knew, but the lust for battle spurred him on. He was only a wild beast at heart, and his wild beast's heart beat high in anticipation of conflict. In the rocky chamber of the hill's center, little Thibaut crouched low against the wall, as far from the hunger-crazed beasts as he could drag himself. He saw the lattice giving to the frantic clawing of the hyenas. He knew that in a few minutes his little life would flicker out horribly beneath the rending, yellow fangs of these loathsome creatures. Beneath the buffetings of the powerful bodies, the lattice sagged inward, until with a crash it gave way, letting the carnivora in upon the boy. Thibaut cast one affrighted glance toward them, then closed his eyes and buried his face in his arms, sobbing piteously. For a moment the hyenas paused, caution and cowardice holding them from their prey. They stood thus glaring at the lad, then slowly, stealthily crouching, they crept toward him. It was thus that Tarzan came upon them, bursting into the chamber swiftly and silently, but not so silently that the keen-eared beasts did not note his coming. With angry growls they turned from Thibaut upon the ape-man, as, with a smile upon his lips, he ran toward them. For an instant one of the animals stood its ground, but the ape-man did not deign even to draw his hunting knife against despised Dengo. Rushing in upon the brute, he grasped it by the scruff of the neck, just as it attempted to dodge past him, and hurled it across the cavern after its fellow, which already was slinking into the corridor, bent upon escape. Then Tarzan picked Thibaut from the floor, and when the child felt human hands upon him instead of the paws and fangs of the hyenas, he rolled his eyes upward in surprise and incredulity, and as they fell upon Tarzan, sobs of relief broke from the childish lips, and his hands clutched at his deliverer, as though the white devil god was not the most feared of jungle creatures. When Tarzan came to the cave mouth, the hyenas were nowhere in sight, and after permitting Thibaut to quench his thirst in the spring which rose nearby, he lifted the boy to his shoulders and set off toward the jungle at a rapid trot, determined to still the annoying howlings of Mamaya as quickly as possible, for he shrewdly had guessed that the absence of her balu was the cause of her lamentation. "He is not dead at the bottom of the river," cried Bukawai. "What does this fellow know about making magic? Who is he anyway that he dare say Bukawai's magic is not good magic? Bukawai sees Mamaya's son. He is far away and alone and in great danger. Hasten then with the 10 fat goats, But he got no further. There was a sudden interruption from above, from the branches of the very tree beneath which they squatted, and as the 5 blacks looked up they almost swooned in fright as they saw the great, white devil god looking down upon them, but before they could flee they saw another face, that of the lost little Thibaut, and his face was laughing and very happy. And then Tarzan dropped fearlessly among them, the boy still upon his back, and deposited him before his mother. Mamaya, Beto, Rabakega, and Mbonga were all crowding around the lad, trying to question him at the same time. Suddenly Mamaya turned ferociously to fall upon Bukawai, for the boy had told her all that he had suffered at the hands of the cruel old man. But Bukawai was no longer there. He had required no recourse to black art to assure him that the vicinity of Mamaya would be no healthful place for him after Thibaut had told his story. And now he was running through the jungle as fast as his old legs would carry him toward the distant lair where he knew no black would dare pursue him. Tarzan, too, had vanished as he had a way of doing, to the mystification of the blacks. Then Mamaya's eyes lighted upon Rabakega. The village witch doctor saw something in those eyes of hers which boded no good to him, and backed away. "So my Thibaut is dead at the bottom of the river," as he the woman shrieked, "and he's far away and alone and in great danger, is he?" Magic, the scorn which Mamaya crowded into that single word, would have done credit to a thespian of the first magnitude. "Magic, indeed," she screamed. "Mamaya will show you some magic of her own," and with that she seized upon a broken limb and struck Rabakega across the head. With a howl of pain, the man turned and fled, Mamaya pursuing him and beating him across the shoulders, through the gateway and up the length of the village street, to the intense amusement of the warriors, the women, and the children who were so fortunate as to witness the spectacle. For one and all feared Rabakega, and to fear is to hate. Thus it was that to his host of passive enemies Tarzan of the Apes added that day 2 active foes, both of whom remained awake long into the night, planning means of revenge upon the white devil god who had brought them into ridicule and disrepute. But with their most malevolent schemings was mingled a vein of real fear and awe that would not down. Young Lord Greystoke did not know that they planned against him, nor, knowing, would have cared. He slept as well that night as he did on any other night, and though there was no roof above him, and no doors to lock against intruders, he slept much better than his noble relative in England, who had eaten altogether too much lobster and drank too much wine at dinner that night,